कि जब आराम से मत बैठी कल।
हेलो हेलो हेलो
हेलो प्लीज।
Hello. 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 Deepak. Deepak. देखो बात में देख आवाज नहीं आ रहा है बात की उसमें जाके
Okay. Hello. Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Hello.
Suraj, can you hear me? Hello. Hello.
Just 1 second. Deepak.
Okay.
Hello.
Hello.
No, your voice is not coming.
Okay, then there is some issue, I guess.
Yes, okay.
Hello. Can you hear me, Suraj?
Yeah, clear.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, fine. Fine.
अच्छा इनके बारे में
आपको जो चाहिए ना उस फील्ड के मास्टर हैं
अच्छा अच्छा
क्या चाहिए क्या
नहीं वो
एक स्टडी
रिपोर्ट
Hello. Now they have done it. They have unmuted me. There is no issue now. Okay. Okay. So should I, speak here? You can hear me. You can hear me now from there. Hello. Okay. Thank you. Hello.
Good morning. Professor Bhaumik, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, yes. It's
Okay.
perfect. Okay.
We can hear you too. So we are running a bit behind schedule, but I would like to start with the kind permission of the chair. The chair of this session is Professor S.K. Bhaumik. He is the director of Patliputra School of Economics in Patna. He has vast experience of teaching and research spanning over 4 decades. Prior to joining Patliputra School of Economics, he served the departments of economics at Calcutta University, Vidyasagar University, and Central University of South Bihar. He specializes in econometrics, economics of agriculture, Indian economic development, and research methodology. His publications include Enhancing Agricultural Productivity and Farmers' Income in Bihar, Reforming Indian Agriculture Towards Employment Generation and Poverty Reduction, Rural Credit of Interest for Institutional Credit in India, and Tenancy Relations and Agrarian Development, a study of West Bengal. Apart from Professor Bhaumik, we have Professor Amit Kurian, who is an assistant professor at the School of Liberal Arts and Sciences, RV University, Bangalore. He is interested in issues at the convergence of environmental change and rural societal dynamics, and works on forest, agrarian, and livelihood issues in Meghalaya, more broadly in Northeast India. He has a PhD in Conservation Science and Sustainability Studies from the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and Environment in Bangalore, where he studied the causes of land use change in Garo Hills in Meghalaya and its consequences for livelihood sustainability. Along with Professor Kurian, we have Professor A.R. Vasavi who's currently an independent researcher based in Bangalore. She was to join us in person today, but unfortunately, due to some last-minute emergencies, she could not make it. However, we have her research paper, which I would read out after Professor Kurian does his presentation. Professor Vasavi is a social anthropologist and an independent researcher based out of Bangalore with interest in agrarian studies, sociology of India, and educational studies. She did her MA and MPhil in sociology from the University of Delhi and a PhD in social anthropology from Michigan State University with a thesis, The Harbingers of Rain, Culture and Drought in Bijapur, India. She has worked at the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and for 14 years at National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bangalore, including a year as Dean of Social Sciences. So now I would hand over the proceedings to Professor Bhaumik and request him to say a few words.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Gupta. Very good morning to all of you. Although we are a bit late to start the session, which in my view is very important in the context of this workshop. And in this session, there are 2 papers already mentioned by Dr. Gupta. In the first paper will be presented by Dr. Amit John Kurian. As I understood, he is a specialist in Northeast agriculture. And we know that Northeast agriculture is different from mainstream agriculture. There is issue of sustainability, there is issue of conservation. Of course, these issues are important for mainland agriculture as well, but these are much more important in the context of Northeast agriculture, which is basically hill agriculture. So in his paper, he will discuss environmental issues, livelihood issues, tenure changes, ecological problems, there are many other issues which he will take up. So without taking time at this moment, I would like to invite him to make his presentation. And I would request him to complete his presentation within 20 minutes.
Hello, am I audible? Okay. All right. I'll thank you very much, Dr. Sinha, Dr. Bhaumik, Asmita here, and Adri for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here amongst a bunch of very heterodox, academics and practitioners. I think it's a real pleasure to sort of make this presentation to all of you. So I think the way I'm sort of planning this talk is to give Is it better? Yeah, I think so. I think this is okay. Yeah. Yeah, so the focus here is primarily on human development, but I think the way human development, is sort of envisaged in the context of, well, everywhere, but especially in the Northeast, in many ways, because the region has such a strong, agrarian, root. It is sort of, that's the pivot around which everything sort of moves. And that's the reason why, I've sort of kept that as the focus. But because agriculture is central, one has to sort of focus on both conservation as well as the development aspects around it. So what you see there is, their sort of, mainstay, which is shifting cultivation, as it's, sort of popularly known, or Jhum, as it's sometimes known in, policy circles. Shifting cultivation is not a term that I particularly enjoy, because it's there is an immediate sort of juxtaposition that this has with settled agriculture being better and this being worse off. So it's sort of so there's a problem in that framing. But regardless, I mean, I can't use the word Sweden, which is the more internationally recognized one, because Indian audience usually is unfamiliar with it, so I'm going with this anyway. So let me begin by saying that I think the rural realities of the Northeast broadly sort of is very poorly understood, as well as there is a certain bias in the way we understand issues there. The regional economy is sort of exoticized for its cultural diversity and forest and agricultural resources. The agricultural mainstay, which is shifting cultivations I was talking to you about. There is also all sorts of different views around this. You have conservationists who look at this and say that this is the major cause of deforestation. And biodiversity laws, agronomists who look at this and say, well, this is unproductive and it causes soil erosion. Policy positions, they've right from the first, I think, 5-year plan, they had the Jhum control schemes that were sort of put in place and so on, which was an extension of the sort of colonial sort of practice. But you also have others, such as agroecologists, like people like Professor P.S. Ramakrishnan and others who had worked in the Northeast, and anthropologists who have also mentioned that this is it's an agriculture that's very well suited for that particular environment and that cultural context. But today in the 21st century, I think the dynamics of this land use change that we see there is very poorly understood. And the emphasis of the talk, I think in some sense, is to sort of try and sort of de-exoticize and to sort of mainstream this perspective. So what I'm planning to do is to sort of give you is to keep Northeast as a focus, but I want to sort of take a deep dive into a village level analysis, something that I did for my PhD, because I think that gives you a nice flavor of how things work in the Northeast. And then using that, I'll give you a sense of what might be the sort of concerns for the next couple of decades, and what maybe the things that we need to sort of think about. This is another sort of way in which we understand the Northeast in popular discourse. It's always seen as the periphery, but if you go there, you will immediately understand that that's a matter of perspective. It's the region has historically been closer. It continues to be closer to to Dhaka, to Kunming, Lhasa, and Yangon. Prior to independence, they have been moving across these borders, these current borders, and doing trade and all sorts of things. So I think some of these things don't quite feature in our sort of current understanding of the way we understand development for that region. So the focus today is therefore to sort of is kind of fourfold. One is to sort of mainstream the way we understand ecology and society, and using the village study to sort of to showcase why what are the causes for land use change that we see there. I'll go a little bit into depth about it. How do we understand the changes that influence socioeconomic, how do these land use changes influence socioeconomic differentiation and livelihood sustainability? And I want to use precarity in some sense, which was the finding from from my work over the last several years. And that perhaps is a good sort of imaginary for the next I think couple of decades for this region. So I want to sort of point out a few things. Firstly, I think there is a need to do some solid mapping of this particular region. And for immediate question would be, well, there's enough people who've been doing mapping of this region to understand what are the resources that you find there, what are the land uses that you see there. But essentially, why bother? But the reason for that is because many of these estimates that we find from there are quite unreliable, as I found during my PhD. And I'll show you why that is. And if you have one of these classes that go wrong, you've got everything else that goes wrong as well. You don't, if you don't, so for instance, most of mapping work that comes from, say, remote sensing, folks who do this sort of work from the region, don't have shifting cultivation as part of their class. The moment you don't have one of those things, you have an immediate problem in terms of asking how much forest there is or how much plantations there is, and so on. So then you need to sort of redo that whole thing all over again. For the next thing is to sort of ask, what is the sort of wide sort of web of causation that that leads to the kind of land use change that we see there. And there are tropes about Northeast societies being very egalitarian and things like this. Are these things true? To what extent is this true? And if at all there is socioeconomic differentiation, along what axis do they take place? I mean, these are things that I think one needs to sort of investigate deeply. So the case study that I'm going to look at is from here in Garo Hills, which is on the sort of western side of Meghalaya, bordering Bangladesh and Assam. Let me deal with the mapping issue first. I think what is the sort of primary concern here? I think the main issue here is that that we need to sort of come up with a good framework for land use mapping classifications across for the country and maybe even for the world. But one of the ways in which mappers do this is by beginning with sort of very universal categories for what what constitutes a forest or what constitutes agriculture, and so on. This is very problematic. This is very problematic because I mean, this is where I have to sort of, take off my ecologist hat and wear, the, social scientist hat and say, well, nature is a social construct. And that's the reason why you need to sort of look at nature using multiple lenses. Because depending on what your normative goals are, how you define your categories will also change. So if biodiversity conservation is your primary goal, then there's no point keeping, having plantations as part of your forest category, which is something that Forest Survey of India, for instance, very effectively does. So that's the thing. So we need to be very clear about definitions and about our normative goals. And yes, that the moment we speak about, we try to sort of maximize on, from a policy perspective, the moment we try to maximize on or optimize on one particular goal, we are immediately sort of, there's a trade-off with other goals. So in some sense, for mapping work, I think what this really means is that you need to effectively create multiple maps for this particular region, or for any region for that matter. Depending on what our sort of goals are, and this is a sort of a conceptual puzzle, that is there even today. So this is the sort of result of the mapping work. I'm not getting into the details of how I did it, but that's the result. The Forest Survey of India estimate for forest in that in this particular district in Garo Hills is roughly 80%, but my own estimate is just about 10%. But the interesting thing to my definition is it's any land that is above 20 years of age. Sort of 20 years vegetation cover that is 20 years of age, because that only that supports a certain amount of biodiversity, certain amount of mammalian diversity, certain amount of bird diversity, and so on. Plantations surely don't fall into that category. It will fall into the category if your concern is, say, carbon sequestration. So you need to be I think we need to be very, very careful about how we sort of mix and merge these things. So that's the thing. But I think importantly, shifting cultivation as a thing, I think one of the things that showed up was this, that continues to be in some sense their main sort of land use there, 40%. This is it's a closer understanding of how they've got this wrong. And in many ways, this elementary work is required. We need to do this at a much sort of broader scale for Northeast, and perhaps even for the rest of the country. I really think so. So let me just sort of run through this because I don't have too much time. It's just to give you an idea of how I went about doing this particular village level work. It was using what I call it's a framework that comes from environmental anthropology, causal historical analysis, primarily using abductive inferential mode of reasoning. We can come to this if you are interested. But essentially the methods that it was a mixed method sort of work that I had used. I wanted to sort of map the village out as well. It's something that I think I don't think anyone has done that for the Northeast. In fact, we don't even know what a village in the Northeast looks like. From a so that was, I felt it was important. Not only to understand what it looks like, but it's also to understand what exists there as land uses, and see what changes may have occurred. But because this was a village study, one had to sort of focus on sort of really ground up understandings. So questions such as socio-economic changes and differentiation and that sort of thing. The categories for these things really had to emerge from below. And I think that's the reason I had to sort of use participant observation as my sort of central pillar. and so on. But there were other things that were involved in this work as well. Now, in understanding, sort of the web of causation that explains land use change, let me just show you some of these things. It's what you see here is this particular village that I, worked in, which I call Asumpara. It's in the middle of West Garo Hills, district. It's roughly, 50%, that's what it looks like, shifting cultivation and plantations. It's very interesting to see here that you have, I mean, what it really is showing, and also shows in my sort of, analysis at the household level surveys, is that you have farmers who have 1 foot in subsistence agriculture and another foot in cash cropping that is sort of catering to the markets. That's what we see here. But it's also reflected in in the way land uses are found there. This is more than one chapter of my PhD in one slide. It's probably not the best way to represent it, but it's the easiest way, I think, to sort of show you what are the sort of somewhat atypical factors or variables that come into play in explaining how changes take place in in a village, in this particular village. The reason I also show this is because the kind of intensification of shifting cultivation or the conversion to plantation crops and so on, it doesn't really fit quite neatly with the kind of theories that have emerged from, let's say, places like Southeast Asia, where we've seen that it's a sort of state-led agribusiness corporations that have gone into expanding oil palm plantations or so on. You see this pattern also in Mizoram, for instance, where the state has kept aside entire districts for oil palm plantations. Interestingly, you don't see that here. What you see is a very different trajectory. You don't see, in fact, I think I ended up spending about 9 months or more in this particular village, and I don't think I saw a single agricultural extension officer who came into the village, and that's very telling. Which then poses the question, how is it that people are then moving to this and to plantations and that sort of thing? And the real sort of explanation is that is a sort of rising need for cash, and that is what essentially is. But I think the important thing is to understand what are the sort of deeper driving forces that are sort of guiding that, and that is a sort of wide range of things. And what makes this possible in some sense is the flexibility of land tenure. And I think that's which is something that they understand amongst themselves as a village. But also equally importantly is the aspect of sort of constitutional autonomy that this region has, which is different from, let's say, other parts of the country. So you don't have, this is not a village that is, let's say, unlike a village that also does shifting cultivation, for instance, say in Madhya Pradesh, which may be living in the shadow of the state. You have the forest department that is constantly sort of, keeping track of what's going on in these villages. You don't have that here. So they can transform their landscapes the way they want it. That is there. Yet another aspect is the element of population, of endogenous population increase. That's something that I noticed. I couldn't, it doesn't. I know it probably doesn't sit well with a lot of environmental scientists, maybe also not with social scientists, but I think for some of these societies which are removed from sort of markets, it's a big distance from markets and so on, this variable, I think, goes on to sort of change the way land gets used. And I think that therefore plays a very strong role. This is the thing. So that's an example of, how a communal sort of, field might look like, where everyone's sort of working together. And then you also have fragmented fields, which they initially take on for shifting cultivation, but then they immediately convert it into plantations. That's what they do. So these innovations are really sort of seen in this landscape. But then what do these changes then mean for socio-economic differentiation? In some sense, the sort of theoretical expectation is that you see marginalization, perhaps, and that work from Southeast Asia in particular. I mean, I was relying a lot on work from Southeast Asia to sort of understand what was taking place here, because the cultural context, the social context, in so many different ways, was closer there than with the rest of India. And so so in some sense, sort of we expect marginalization when you have something like this. So in a way, you do see this, but then what is interesting to see is the axis along which this takes place. In Garo societies are primarily, they are matrilineal societies. In a Garo society, what you have is you have, every household has, the youngest daughter is the sort of heiress, and she and her husband in some sense ends up sort of owning a lot of capital, and this difference that you see is also tightly correlated with the date of establishment of plantation crops, or to put it in other words, those families which are sort of heiress families have got the first foot at the door to establish plantation crops, because the headman of the village gave them that sort of right to do so. But there are reasons for this as well. When you look at it from a slightly more ethnographical or anthropological reason, there are reasons for this. It's partly because the responsibilities that they also have towards community and towards the household is also equally large as compared to non-heiress households. So that is also there. So you don't really see an element of, I mean, I didn't see an element of animosity among non-heiress households for the fact that the others were, they had more capital, because they said, well, they need it, so that's this was something that I observed, which I thought was quite interesting. So in some sense, the flexible land tenure and obligations to reproduce this social system not only legitimizes differential capital ownership. So this exclusion in some sense is from access to certain lands is unavoidable, but as I was saying, heiress status comes with responsibilities, and there is a moral economy that is at work, which obviates sort of extreme marginalization. That's a sort of quote that tells you a little bit about how that operates. I'll leave it there for a few seconds if you want to read it. So that's essentially a group of cousins. It's a group of cousins at a matri locality within within the village, right? So and now I sort of move on to this sort of imaginary of precarity, and I think I dwell on this because we see a couple of things. One thing that I guess the popular imagination of the Northeast is a place as having a tremendous forest cover. I really doubt it. I don't think there is too much, sort of it's a narrative that needs to be questioned. And I think so there is a declining forest cover issue. Fallow cover is also sort of declining because there is shortening of fallow periods. So essentially, we are looking at a lot of places which have a lot of weeds. There is a certain amount of management, but it's it's something that one needs to sort of keep in mind. Something that sort of that works alongside this is the reduction in agro biodiversity, something that these communities are known for. But there is increasingly cereal crops are no more planted in the fields. They do have it in their kitchens. You find them there, but it's not really planted. So you have transformations that are taking place, socio-economic transformations that are taking place, but this is not, it's not a case of, sort of full-blown, class divisions that are occurring right now. But how this may play out into the future is something that, we need to sort of keep a close watch on. However, there are other regions, for instance, Arunachal Pradesh, where, for instance, which is had a very different sort of trajectory because of the amount of state inflow of, inflow of capital from the state, which therefore has led to, very different sorts of trajectories. The creation of a sort of very, very strong tribal elite that has come up there, and so on. We don't really very strongly see that here in Garo Hills, but I think that is taking place in other parts of Northeast. Another sort of reason to sort of talk about precarity is because is with regard to how feeble this whole economy is in terms of to a shock. So the pandemic was a classic example. When you had the pandemic, there was a simultaneous sort of pest outbreak that took place with on Erica plantations, and that led to a very heavy sort of economic loss. It's not something that I could sort of quantify because I was away from the field, but it's something that I managed to sort of gather from people who I was in touch with. And this is something that I think we need to keep in mind, the aspects of monocultures. I think there are other ways to sort of think about plantations and plantation economies. Indonesia, for instance, have had in the past have had the concept of jungle rubber. They used to have it, and they used to do it. Smallholders used to do it sustainably. Perhaps we need to sort of think about plantation agriculture in slightly different terms, and not think of it like this. If it's, but the important thing I want to sort of highlight here is that if it was not for shifting cultivation during that period, I think they would have really gone through a very bad, very bad, sort of shock, because it was during the pandemic. It was mostly you had instances of people cutting down plantations and reverting to shifting cultivation because that was the immediate way in which they could get subsistence. The other aspect sort of keep in mind is the element of community, which is very, very strong in the Northeast. There's a lot that they can do because that's the way villages are organized, and so on. So, for instance, in a very, very short period, you had Bengali merchants and who are the primary sort of people who are part of the the link between the villages and the outside market. They sort of ceased to come into the region because that's what the lockdown entailed. But very quickly the community managed to sort of reorient things, and they had sort of what I call neo traders, people who were not really involved in that business, who started but who knew something about it, who began to sort of take Erica produce and then take it to the nearest possible area for exchange and that sort of thing. So that's that's kind of landscape that they would draw much of their resources from. But there are also other things that in the pandemic, I think most of us, I don't know how many of us knew about this, but there was a very strong case of an outbreak of African swine fever that took place in the Northeast. It came in I mean, thankfully it didn't, it's not something that spreads to human beings, so it didn't sort of become a sort of a full-blown problem. But the livestock economy was affected, majorly. It also spread to wildlife. So wild boars were affected, for instance, and that's something that human beings consume. Whether that's legal or not is a different question, but it's so these sorts of things can and I think mainstream media is sort of completely ignorant of all of this. We hear very little about it, and so there's a need to sort of look at what's taking place there much more. So yeah, I think I've pretty much covered some of this. I think essentially the point is this, that I think the over reliance on monocultures, which is something that a lot of households are now doing, I think it really sort of cuts into subsistence agriculture. It has and I think they may have to sort of pay a price for this if that's that is the sort of road that they're planning to sort of go down. And that's one can only hope that that doesn't happen. And the reason for sort of emphasizing subsistence agriculture is also because the hill economies of the Northeast, they are earthquake prone. The other is that they are flood prone, and so on. So I think that it's a very frequent thing to see that there is a cut of a lack of access to markets, either because there was a flood or either there was an earthquake or some such thing. Mostly natural disasters, or roads that collapse or some such thing. So as a consequence, I think it's important to sort of keep in mind, self-reliance is something that I think we need to sort of keep in mind. The other thing that comes, that go hand in hand with sort of monoculture expansion is now the element of water scarcity. I don't think I ever thought that a region like this would go through something like that, but this is something that I've started to see in the villages already. For the first time I think in their lives, people are now saying that they don't have enough water in the lean seasons, and that's a very serious problem. So yeah, and clearly these are people who have aspirations of different sorts, and now with for a region like Garo Hills or other places like say Nagaland and so on, which is now devoid of militancy issues and that sort of thing, how is it going to play out? Are we going to see tremendous outmigration, such as say Nagaland, for instance, has that pattern? But you don't see that from Garo Hills, for instance, because of the nature of the educational scenario there. You don't really see that, and there is also there are other studies who have looked at this, looked at the region and said that there is an element of place attachment, that you don't want to sort of go away from their sort of their cultural space. So that's just a figure to sort of show you that there is a broader trend of more than about 30% rise in population. And I think for the future, I think we need to sort of think about this agrodiversity that we see there, and maybe there are possibilities of this that can be fed into the supplemental nutrition program of the ICDS and so on. I think it's possible to do these things. But there are increasing concerns, as along the lines of what I was saying, which is there are signs of maternal lack of nutrition for mothers and for very young children. Cases like this that are increasingly being reported. And there are also deeper structural issues. We could talk about these I don't know if I'm running out of time. So it's, yeah, so I think that's my last slide. So it's, yeah, just one last thing I think is what I wanted to say was that the welfare schemes such as the MG and REGS, I think in this context, I think goes a long way in supporting very income poor households. That's something that needs to be kept in mind. Climate change is something that we talk about a lot, but I think I want to also mention, as partly because I come from an environmental field, that I think this could also be a distraction, because there are other much stronger variables at play. So for instance, water scarcity is not really in the region, I don't think has anything to do with climate change. I strongly feel that it has more to do with the kind of land uses and that are changing. So yeah, thank you. Mithala Nangna Nangipa Salong China means thank you and have a nice day in Garo.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Kurian. I think it would be better to have the questions, because the other speaker is not present here physically. So we may not have any opportunity to have interactions. So let us have the questions.
Sorry, Professor Bhumik, I think Dr. Vasavi will join for the question answer session.
Okay. Then you please start presentation.
So then I'll just quickly read as much as, how much time do I have?
It's 10:33.
Okay.
And the session has to end at 11 o'clock. So you take 15-20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes maximum.
Yeah, so. Yeah, so we are running slightly late. So I'll try to read as much as possible quickly. And then I would want a little bit of time for the question answers with the actual author. So yeah, this is a bit unusual, and I feel a bit like olden days Doordarshan newsreader. I'll try to be as dispassionate as possible. The title of Dr. Vasavi's talk is Reassembling Rural India. Post-colonial rural India has been subject to an unusual form of structural inversion, while its key structural characteristics, that of being defined by the caste system, has been largely retained. The potential of a long tradition of sophisticated knowledge systems that make possible heterogeneous and sustainable agricultural systems and complementary cottage industries has largely been relegated, rendered obsolete, or erased. Matching this inversion, there has been imposition of models that are ecologically, economically, and socially inappropriate, but which suit political expediencies. As a result, contemporary rural India is constituted and marked not only by complexity, but also by contradictory trends. Even as overall poverty levels have decreased with increase in real wages, and there has been improvements in basic infrastructure and the provisioning of food through public distribution systems, reports indicate extant forms of agrarian distress associated not only with a decelerating agricultural economy and expressed mostly in form of suicides by farmers, migration, malnutrition, human trafficking, and multiple forms of human and civil rights violations. Adverse integration into the dominant assemblage. The adverse integration of India's diverse and plural agricultural rural systems has implications for the ways in which the rural and agricultural are politically, economically, and socially positioned and impact the livelihoods, citizen rights, and opportunities of being for rural citizens. The economic integration of rural India into dominant apparatus is evident in the extent to which agriculture has been increasingly commercialized, making the external inputs and technology dependency the primary route for increasing integration, even the smallest producers, into a capitalist circuit. The overall impact of this has meant an increasing differentiation of rural society with varied significance for each of the different classes. Access to capital market technology has leveraged large landholders to combine agricultural incomes with entrepreneurial business and political capital. The result is that many large landowners are now regional political satraps who see the rural as primarily a vote bank and are no longer vested fully in the economic and ecological sustainability of the region. With increases in real wages have improved the lot of the landless, it is the small and marginal cultivators who are trapped into the circuits of indebtedness, precarity, and high-risk agriculture that the new models of capital technology and external inputs agriculture enforces. The resulting retrogression in agriculture has meant that small cultivators especially seek to be out of agriculture, and their strategies consist of the choices of either leasing out their land to large cultivators, selling their land, or even abandoning cultivation. The ecological impact of such a dominant model of agriculture has rendered agriculture to become an extractive industry, and much of this is evident in the extent to which soil, waters, and seeds are in severe conditions of depletion. Matching this is the expansion and intensification of the extractive economy in the Adivasi and especially forest belts, where a repairist approach to resources, especially minera extraction, has defined all democratic norms and ecological concerns. New techno-financial regimes seek to integrate the ruler into larger administrative and financial structures that do not assure either transparency, efficiency, or expediency. Instead, as the implementation of Aadhaar, demonetization, the GST have highlighted, these are the new mechanisms of surveillance and subordination that have only made life more onerous and cumbersome for a majority of rural citizens. The failure to address the entrenched social and economic inequities and distortions of rural India and its agrarian systems are compounded by the political response to such trends. Far from policies that could effectively address the myriad and interlinked problems, the state has deployed programs which do not emanate from any significant policy framework, that are instead piecemeal ad hoc programs that seek to elevate the programs faced primarily by large farmers or dominant landed caste groups. Populist programs such as free electricity for irrigation, moratorium on loans, minimum support price, and more recently, income support schemes to farmers have all been garnered primarily by the landed elite and have not resulted in resolution of key structural problems. At another level, the state's attempt to address the extent rural distress and political systems attempt to appease voters has resulted in the deployment of welfare governmentality, which, as the late Kalyan Sanyal described, the attempt by the state to appease the deprived majority, even as it deploys preferential policies that enable capitalist accumulation by disposition. The growth of such welfare governmentality via a large number of provisioning programs combines with electoral populism such as distribution of consumer goods, especially during elections, and has led to the growth of a class of middlemen or political entrepreneurs who act as mediators in enabling people to access these goods. The impact of this had led twofold. At one level, there is the diffusion of political mobilization across class and regional lines and a failure to seek addressal for real structural problems. The inability of rural citizens to realize the foundational problems of their situation and to have risen in protest against the draconian demonetization and the imposition of GST are examples of the extent to which periodic welfare governmentality have appeased and silenced rural citizens. At another level, it has led to increasing tensions and conflict in rural societies, as is evident in the rise of violence related to cut money in the case of West Bengal. That the real results of such economic distortions have not manifested in worsening condition across the rural belts is largely linked to the fact that since the mid-90s, the integration of rural India into the urban economy has enabled a portion of the rural citizens to have non-rural, non-agricultural incomes, which in turn have enabled the growth of a new rural middle class, which is increasingly an aspirational rural middle class that also seeks to be integrated into the dominant society and subscribes to the spreading political religion of Hindutva. In sum, the state has subject rural India to the contradictory imprint of an economics of neglect by failing to allocate adequate funds and administrative support, and a politics of rescue in which the problems are declared to be resolved by periodic doles of goods and money. At each juncture, the submergence of key challenges with populist appeasement and policies are resulted in compounding the problems. With such adverse integration indicates is that the citizenship of rural residents has been severely compromised, and democratic deficits that mark their lives also constitute the very fabric of the political system. The absence of political accountability, the strengthening of patronage democracy in which political representatives are also enveloped within the neoliberal economy mean that the rural and agrarian have become only a site of political manipulation and economic expropriation. In identifying these challenges and seeking to formulate new policies and programs, it would be pertinent to call for a fundamental shift in conceptualizing rural and agricultural economies and to recognize the foundational rights of the marginalized citizens. The definitions and assessments of what are until now been identified as indices of development, empowerment, and democracy need to shift. Instead of being associated with markers of mainstream lifestyle, financial access, and electoral participation, respectively. Meanings and impact of these categories must enable a realization of decent and appropriate living for all. Tying to these policies that enable the flourishing of the ecological and culturally diversity of people that enable localized administrative and management will be key. In sum, the new orientation for policies for rural and agrarian India must eschew the diverse integration of ruralities of India into a political and economic apparatus that appropriates the labor, resources, and capital for rural citizens, distorts their knowledge, skills, and identities, and depletes the natural resource base and ecologies of rural regions. New imaginaries, parameters, approaches, and political will are required to reassemble the key structures of rural India. If the existing caste class structure is taken to be the key barrier, then the rich corpus of knowledge systems in agriculture, medicine, architecture, land use, natural resource management, weaving, smithy, pottery, carpentry, artisanships recognized for their potential and possibilities. If instead of these adverse integration of rural India into the dominant industrial urban capital market assemblage, a process of decentralized consolidation becomes the guiding marker, then many of the challenges of the complexities and contradictions that have emerged over the past decades can be addressed. Critical and holistic reviews of all existing programs related to rural and agrarian India are urgently required. Unpacking the limitations of such programs, their neglect, impact, the fallout, and conceptualizing regionally appropriate and variable practices which can be interlinked into a range of factors that will be key. At least 4 key domains and structural shifts are required to reassemble rural India in order to address the entrenched structural contradictions and enable the potential to be realized. Rural as a viable political economy and societies, challenging the rural versus urban agriculture versus industrial divides. The rural and the agriculture must be recognized as foundational economies that have significance for the national economy and the well-being and citizenship rights of majority of people. Economic planning and political decision making need to focus on enabling new economies in rural spaces that will address the conventional rural versus urban versus agricultural divides. New rural processing, production and value addition units will provide better economic value to rural products and generate employment. Both decentralized small-scale agro-processing units, value addition units, new manufacturing and assembling units need to be established in rural areas itself. As several studies have elaborated, the Green Revolution as dominant models of agriculture in India has led to ecological, economic, and social instabilities. Much of rural India now bear the negative imprint of this model, which is being buttressed by the inclusion and promotion of Fourth Industrial Revolution. In addition to these, there are new trends of co-opting alternative approaches such as agroecologist, trusteeship approach, and the recent promotion of millets to endorse the International Declaration of 2023 as the Year of the Millets. Much of these have rendered agriculture to become part of the extractive economy, and policies to address these depredations as are required on an urgent basis. In their place, a range of schemes and programs that enable the restoration and conservation of soils, water, and seeds are urgently required. Recognizing regionally diverse agroecological complexes and the knowledge systems associated with them can be the key to halting the current agricultural regimes that have promoted a separation of agriculture from ecology and of production from local food cultures. Similarly, for forest dwelling and Adivasi habitations, the recognition of habitat rights and the promotion of regional conservation come production models can be worked out. Instead of the allocations of annual payments to cultivators, it may be more important to incentivize cultivation practices that combine three dimensions. These include providing incentives and support to the cultivators that can be encouraged, facilitating the transition to sustainable agriculture, conserving natural resources, instituting and practicing climate resilient practices, which will decrease the risk of associated with sharp climate fluctuations and loss of crops. Attempt to address these vexations, issues of landlessness and problems of suboptimal landholding need to go beyond the land distribution model. Even as the issues of landlessness and suboptimal landholding continue, many regional states have formulated policies which have repealed earlier land reform and distribution acts that have promoted new laws that permit both neoliberal agricultural land market and increasing integration of rural land into the larger speculative real estate markets. Instead of these policies, strict rules against the growing consolidation of land under large owners or corporates should be formulated, and policies that promote group farming, agriculture, and rural cooperatives and farmer producer organizations that are voluntary collective of farmers of all castes can be encouraged and supported through various schemes. Case studies of some of the farmer producer organizations and group farming indicate the high potential that are these structures for addressing both issues of both the landless and marginal and small farmers. In addition, such collectives or networks can provide leverage to farmers in market and capital transactions, hereby enhancing their bargaining power. There's an urgent need to ensure that the key public institutions such as the Panchayati Raj institutions, education and health sectors become viable, democratic and effective institutions. Despite the fact that many panchayats have been captured by vested interests, they have the potential to be decentralized bodies that can foster policies, practices of democratic governance. Their high potential is evident in the fact that some villages have drawn on this institution, challenge caste hierarchies, privilege, and power to facilitate local development, enable women to emerge as leaders, make democratic institution building and accountability possible at the most foundational level. Failure to adequately monitor, support, and fund PRIs have led to them languishing in many states and the failure to realize their potential. Similarly, the failure of key public institutions such as the health and education system to cater to the need of the aspirational rural citizens exacerbate the absence of opportunities of being for a large proportion of citizens. The ability of these institutions to deliver high quality services will lessen the burden on the rural population to access these services through private capital or to fall into debt traps. As studies have indicated, the absence of these basic services are concomitant with lower standards of living and with negative impacts on overall economic performance. To realize these completely new health and education policies will have to be facilitated so as to enable a range of institutions to cater to various varied needs and levels of rural requirements. Cases across India that have successfully promoted organic or sustainable agriculture, the slow growth of farmer-producer organization, and evidence from various regions that highlight the positive contributions of panchayats indicate that all the above suggestions are feasible. What is required is a shift from dominant parameters and perspectives that seek to fit rural India into existing dominant economic models. Albert Howard, considered a pioneer of natural farming movement, had asserted previously, the real arsenal of democracy is a fertile soil, the fresh produce of which is the birthright of the nations. Extending this recommendation, it would do us good to recognize the centrality of rural India as the site of varied soils encapsulating both biological and socio-cultural diversity, and as being the foundation on which decentralized democracy, social justice, economic equity, and ecological sustainability can be imagined and realized. Recognizing and strengthening the ecological and social diversity of rural India would be the route to strengthening the cultural plurality and lived democracy of India. Thank you.
Okay. So can we have the questions from the audience? So no question from audience on these two presentations?
Yeah, there are questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. This is for last presentation. Ma'am, you have talked about the FPO. Okay, it's okay. Okay, it's okay. Okay, it's okay. So you have discussed about the FPO, but if you see the data in Bihar, the participation of female is very low. In fact, in other states, the participation of female is high. And there are other challenges which Bihar is also facing, that is the nutritional challenge. So do you think that if we can add female in FPO, that can have impact on nutrition, nutritional issues also? So just
Vasavi, it's nice to see you again on screen. I have a question actually to both of you, which is about sort of typologies of mapping. I think both your papers address both actual mapping strategies in terms of methodology, as well as sort of a conceptual terrain that has changed over time for both of you as researchers. And I wondered if both of you could comment a little bit, Amit, in your case, to describe some differences that you have seen within Meghalaya, but also with some of the other northeastern states, and to answer why you think it has taken this long to develop a differentiated geography, for want of another phrase. right? What is it in terms of methodology that has been so complex, that has led us to this impasse? And I would request Vasavi, if you could, to address the same from a kind of a conceptual terrain, because you could argue as well that in our understanding both of rural and urban discussions, in a way, there's been quite a lot of churn on the urban side of discussions about how you would look at land use, what you might consider as new useful categories for analysis. So if I could leave those questions with both of you, it would, I think, enrich us to hear.
Hello,
Any-
should I respond?
No other question from there, from the audience there? If there is no question, I have a few queries. So you can answer all the questions and queries together. That will be better. Now, let me first of all congratulate both of you for providing alternative perspectives to understand firstly hill agriculture, and then in the context of Indian agriculture as a whole, how we go about it, about agriculture, how we view agriculture, agrarian issues. I broadly agree with Dr. Vasavi about the suggestions she has provided. Now, just a few queries I have. Now, firstly, these days we hear a lot about promotion of millets cultivation, following the call given by FAO, International Year of Millets. And similarly, many of the state governments, including Bihar government, is trying to formulate policies to promote millets cultivation. As far as the nutritional benefits, health benefits, sustainability aspects of millets are concerned, there is no question about it. But my only concern is, just as when we started Green Revolution during mid-60s, we know what happened afterwards. One of the problems that Green Revolution created was in the form of interstate inequality. Only those states who could access the benefits of Green Revolution technology, their agriculture developed, their farmers' income improved, and vast areas of our country could not benefit as much as Punjab, Haryana, or Western UP, and later on Tamil Nadu and some other pockets. Now, in the context of millets also, my worry is it might lead to interstate disparity, because millets cultivation is probably more suitable for central and western India and not as much suitable in eastern India, where the dominant crops are rice, primarily rice. In the context of Bihar, it is rice, maize, and to some extent wheat. These are the crops. Now, in any region, the consumption habit of the people is also determined by the crops they cultivate over a period of time, of course. So the point is, if and this scheme of millets cultivation is being promoted by central government also. I'm not saying that we should not promote it, but what I'm saying is this type of policy may not be equally applicable across the states of India. We need state-specific policies to promote cultivation, crop cultivation, selection of crops, etc. Now, suppose that we produce millets. There will be two problems in future. Firstly, it will take a long time to change our food habit going from rice to millet. And as I find in the literature, the people who are habituated with rice and wheat consumption, they may not like millets for consumption purpose. at least in the immediate term, I mean, in the near future. So this is one problem, how we transform our consumption habit from these to rice and wheat to millet. And secondly, only those states which, I mean, whose agriculture is suitable for millets cultivation would benefit from government support. Other states may try millets cultivation, but they may not be so much successful, which will lead to interstate disparity. The same type of disparity which happened after adoption of Green Revolution technology. So how you view this issue of millets cultivation across India? This is first query. The second query is, I also fully agree with you that the need of the hour is to go in for group farming, given that the majority of the farmers are marginal and small in our country. In the context of Bihar, more than 90% of the farmers have, belong to that category of marginal and small farmers. Same is true about West Bengal and those states which are densely populated. So in this context, group farming is one possibility that we can consider in order to raise our efficiency level, efficiency of production. And then there is huge problem of marketing of agricultural produce. Along with that, FPOs are very important. That also we understand. Now, in the context of FPOs, it is all about a kind of cooperative effort to solve some of the problems of marketing, input supply, and so on. But in my view, we had cooperative movement in the past also. We read in history about cooperative movement. But the cooperative movement fails because of the very psychology of the people. It seems to me that people's attitude for cooperation is very important. And since the people are by and large individualistic, therefore each individual would try to maximize his own interest. And therefore, how we develop that culture, it is all about cooperation between different individuals. And it is through this and collective effort. So how we do it, how we implement that policy in practice. Now, these days, FPOs are coming up. Many groups are being formed. But some of the evaluation studies point out that many of the groups remain on paper. And in terms of activity, they are not moving forward, as much as you expect. So how we, encourage people, how we develop that cooperative spirit among the people. In my view, this is all about psychology of the people. It maybe behavioral economists will also be able to explain this aspect. My last query to you is about Panchayati Raj institutions. I can say that Panchayati Raj institutions, I'm saying from my own experience in my state, West Bengal, if Panchayati Raj institutions, elections for Panchayati Raj, panchayats, are fought along party lines, then it will lead to all kinds of problems. You mentioned about the problems which, that problem of cut money, etc. So in a situation when panchayat elections are, fought along party lines, there will be very, hard competition between political parties to capture the panchayats. And since panchayats are the main agents for administration at the village level, at the block level, even district level, so obviously there will be corruption. Obviously, those who support my party, I will favor them, and we will not have an objective solution to the problem of rural India through Panchayati Raj institutions. So don't you think that it is time to think about non-political panchayats? So this is the query. Now coming to the first paper, again, I have just one or two queries. The first thing is, as far as I could view from this presentation, you collected data, that for mapping purpose, your data refer to 2013-14, if I'm correct. And you have mentioned that shifting cultivation absorbs 39% of the areas, plantation 30%, old forest 10%, and wet rice cultivation 9%. So altogether it is 89%. What about the remaining 11%? So this is my question, just a query. I mean, for which purpose 11% of the areas in that village that you have surveyed, I mean, for what purpose that area is used? This is one. And secondly, my query is, you observed in the context of your studied village, a shift, I mean, a shift from shifting cultivation to plantation, cultivation based on plantation. Now, is there any economics behind this shift also, apart from other factors which you have mentioned? What I'm trying to know is, have you carried out any cost benefit analysis or cost returns analysis for two different modes of cultivation? And have you found that in the context of plantation cultivation, it is much more profitable, much more remunerative from economic sense? From economic sense, if it is so, then that also talks about the rationality of these farmers, of these people. So what is the economics behind this shift? If a particular mode of cultivation is not profitable in the ultimate analysis, then that shift will not take place. So what I'm saying is, economic factors are also important apart from other factors which you have mentioned from your anthropological perspective. So these are the two queries, if you could explain. Thank you. Now, following the sequence, let us have the first speaker to respond first, and then you please take up.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. So I think to answer Professor Smita's question, I think the issue with the mapping methodology, I think I can look at it from two perspectives. One is what I would think is a disciplinary perspective. It's the fixation that geographers have to map out the world as, the world is seen as a single reality. And it's a sort of a, I guess, a Cartesian way of, looking at the world. It's a single reality. And also the sort of excessive drive towards looking for generalizations in understanding land use categories. And that's where you start having, what do we call something as a forest? So then you have, 10% forest cover or 10% ground cover viewed from the satellite. So basically 10% of the pixel will be one class of forest, and a 40% pixel of the pixel is, will be a different class of forest, and that sort of thing. Part of the issue is this, and I think this excessive focus towards this is seen mostly among physical geographers who do this sort of work, who also occupy institutions such as Institute of Remote Sensing and places like this. They are the only ones who are there. The related issue is that often the purpose of the mapping is not to address a societal need. The purpose of the mapping is the mapping itself. It's a sort of a and which is partly also the reason why you keep seeing. I mean, if you do just a web search for mapping from Northeast, there are hundreds of papers. There's no shortage of it. So, but then if you were to sort of look at it and say, well, what are the categories that you actually see there? Any person who walks into the Northeast will say, well, you see shifting cultivation everywhere, but I don't see this on their maps. Or if you do see it, the categories are all mixed up. So you don't have, you'll have one category which is called a wasteland, and another category that's called, which is obviously a very value loaded, statement, category to say something is a wasteland. Another one which is, shifting cultivation, active cultivation field, and another one which is a fallow. So then you're wondering what exactly they've done. So I think part of it is this. The reason why some of this also takes place is because of very heavy sort of over reliance on in-lab work. So a good chunk, I think I would imagine a good chunk of the work is mostly takes place from sitting inside the laboratory. So you have computer systems, and you can look at it, and using light waves that are reflected, you can identify something as something else. So I think that's partly one of the thing. The other focus is, of course, I think I would imagine the state's focus of not wanting to show shifting cultivation as part of the set of categories that exist in some of the northeastern states. And this I have seen in even at the agricultural department level. When I go look for statistics from there, you don't see these categories there. So I think that partly explains why it's taken, it takes a very different viewpoint to sort of address that issue. And shifting cultivation only shows up as a category in the wasteland atlas of India. So that's the other thing. To answer Professor Baumik's question, so the 11% of the landscape that you were talking about, it consists mostly of wet rice cultivation, which is sort of paddy cultivation in some areas. But there's also agroforestry and things of that sort, which is found around so settlement agriculture, settlement areas, and so on, which is there. I mean, they were not the most important categories to show, which is why I didn't show it. That's all. That's about it. You asked about the the economic logic of the farmer to sort of convert shifting cultivation to plantations, and also whether I did any cost-benefit analysis. I did not do a cost-benefit analysis as part of the work. Something that I did do, however, is to sort of get a sense of how, for every sort of hectare that's converted, or rather, for hectare to hectare calculation that I had done, it still shows that shifting cultivation continues to be more profitable on a sort of a hectare to hectare basis. The economic logic of the farmer is that for 1 hectare of or 1 hectare of land which is under active cultivation, you have 6 others which is under fallow, which is in some sense lying quote unquote useless, and that land can effectively get converted to plantations. I think so that's the logic that is driving the farmer to convert land towards otherwise they have to leave it as it is. They have to leave it fallow because it's the fallow that sort of regenerates the vegetation and then allows for burning, which then ensures that there is cultivation that's possible in shifting cultivation. So that's the that's the logic. But hectare to hectare comparison, it's shifting cultivation continues to be more profitable. That's what I found. Yeah.
Okay.
I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Okay, Professor. Dr. Bashavi, please.
Yes. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to apologize for not having been able to come and be there with all of you. And thank you to the young lady who made such an excellent presentation of my talk. To respond to the queries, the first one about nutrition, it's an important issue, but I think safeguarding nutritional security, which is important to go beyond just food security, is to, I think one needs to go beyond even FPOs. In fact, one of the suggestions that some of us have been making is the need to have crop planning at not only the district level, but at the regional level, bearing in mind the traditional local food cultures which were important. Because across India, what you're seeing is the spread of commercial cultivation has meant that local food crops have been displaced, and therefore local food cultures have also changed. For example, in Madhya Pradesh, where soya bean has spread, so much, and there's been a displacement of the local wheat, wide varieties of wheat and even millets that were grown, or even rice and other kinds of crops, local pulses and greens, have meant that large numbers of people are actually now malnourished, although they could be getting higher income by selling soya into the market. So it's very important to look at both crops that are not only linked to local food production, but also have some amount of commercial value. So that is important. And therefore, issues of food security need to look at nutritional security. Very often these have been disengaged. For example, we know the PDS, which has been promoted, and nowadays, especially during elections, more and more amounts of rice and wheat are being given through the PDS. But we know that the quality of that is very, very poor. And now there is this huge attempt, for example, in Chhattisgarh, to do what is called fortification, nutritional fortification, which again is chemical based and therefore not advisable at all. So why would not the local staple grains be sustained and also be promoted is something that we need to look at very seriously. And thank you, Smita, for this question on mapping. It's a very important issue. Unlike the mapping of, say, forest areas, which are done sort of by the forest department and quite thoroughly using lots of new technologies like, using satellite-based mapping, etc. The mapping of rural India is so outdated and very, very inadequate. For example, the very definition of the rural is based primarily on population, which is so shocking, which is in the census, so many numbers of people. If it is much more than this, this is a semi-urban settlement, urban settlement, etc., and also the way in which panchayat zones are formed. So to go beyond this administrative and population-based mapping, to have a new sense of the diversity of ruralities, it's very important to go back to ecological mapping. For example, the agroclimatic zones of India, which have only 24, if you look at those, even the microclimatic, agroclimatic zones, you would have many, many more, something like 126 or something across the country. So to use that and to link it then to population, but also because some of them have new industries, new kinds of economic activities. So there has to be a compilation of these varied factors and then a mapping done to promote any kind of decentralized, either crop planning or even the promotion of decentralized economies itself. So very important as to what criteria we would use and also what kind of new technologies would be used. Professor Bhaumik, thank you for all these series of questions. I completely endorse the caution that you called for in promoting millets. This is something that we have been talking about a lot here in Karnataka because it was the first in which we actually had a millet mission, which is now put on the back burner. But has people who themselves have promoted millets have cautioned, it's very important to not promote millets as a monocrop, first of all. Second, millets were grown primarily in the arid and semi-arid, in the dry belts. They were not part of the wet belts, and as you rightly pointed out, not in eastern India at all. Third, millets has multi-crops were grown with pulses, oilseeds, and grains. There were they were complementary companion crops that were grown. And to promote it as a monocrop, commercialized, again, chemical-based, crop would defy the very purposes and the strength of millets. In fact, we think such a millet mission, if it comes through the international networks, which are then again based by agribusiness, they would even destroy the existing millet cultivations, which is primarily non-chemical, non-commercial based and very ecologically specific. So there, in fact, there are dangers of such a mono kind of model being promoted. So that's very important to realize. Second, the second issue that you've highlighted about group farming. Again, very important to distinguish group farming from cooperatives. In the history of cooperatives in India, first of all, we know that cooperative farming was never promoted seriously. Group farming was something that Chaudhry Charan Singh had actually spoken about. He's written, if people read his writings now, when in Uttar Pradesh he was trying to consolidate smallholders into larger things, that was what he was trying to promote, actually. But we know that the cooperative movement took off only in dairy, for dairy, for milk, but all of which we know in the context of sugarcane, it has been completely co-opted by big sugarcane barons, and therefore has defied the very idea and purpose of cooperatives. So bearing these experiences in mind, and the few group farming that has emerged here and there in Andhra, a little bit in Tamil Nadu, in Karnataka, those which have been formed voluntarily by farmers who own land in contiguous areas, who pool it together as a collective who will say, I have 2 acres and half an acre, quarter acre, come to terms in how they pool not only land and resources, but labor and capital, and then access state support for inputs such as, subsidies for, either seeds or, all the rest, building tanks, etc., all the other agri inputs, etc. But those, and I think the few that are successful indicate that those formations can be incentivized now, which is what I was trying to argue, that instead of all the payments that are being made, for example, the Kisan Sanman was made only to farmers who own land. Look at what has happened in Telangana, where they have distributed huge amounts of sums to people who own land. Large amounts have actually gone to big landowners and not to the landless, and many, many small cultivators don't have land titles. So how do you address these problems, these administrative problems, is also then to get not only smaller cultivators and the land. In fact, in group farming, in the area where we live, very successful in a village close to us, they are, out of the 26 people, at least 8 to 9 of them are landless workers who by the strength of their knowledge and labor are actually members of that group farming. They're saying we don't have land, but the others have taken them because without these workers, this group farming would not work. Because so many people who are landed actually don't work on land. So that was also a way in which there needs to be a redefinition of group farming to include landless workers and other people who can come in on a voluntary basis. And Kutumbashri, which is doing in Kerala, again, it's form of group farming. Landless women who are coming together and hiring in, taking on lease other pieces land, but working together, sharing the produce and then sharing the profits is also a good example of group farming. So I think incentivizing, promoting, giving it much more support in multiple ways is something to go forward with. Panchayat Raj institutions, as you rightly said, should not be on political party basis. In fact, when the 73rd Amendment was made, it was the key thing. It said elections to these basic grassroots institutions should not be on political party basis. If you remember those debates, and in fact, Karnataka started the 73rd Amendment movement. And the first 10 years, elections were actually mostly on non-party basis. And over the years, it has garnered, become entrenched into party politics. And we know all the tensions and also the corruption by buying votes, and or this whole thing of proxy candidates, where they're reserved candidates, you buy that person and you say, okay, you be the sarpanch, but I will actually run the show for you. That kind. So I think any initiative to strengthen Panchayat Raj institutions also need to seriously contest this and say that from the gram to the mandal to the Jilla Panchayat thing, it should absolutely be on a non-party basis. In fact, some of the very interesting studies show that functioning panchayats which have actually defied politics, the political parties, a few villages have said we don't want political parties to come, and this is our panchayat, have actually been successful. The very well studied and documented successful panchayats in Maharashtra have actually been beyond a party. They don't have the parties involved at all. It is, of course, yes, person-centered, but that person, along with other volunteers and other elected members, have actually run very effective institutions. The two very big, well-known panchayats now in Tamil Nadu are actually also run in on non-party lines. So thank you for these related questions, and I'm happy to answer anything else if there are more questions. Thank you.
Okay. If anyone has any other question. Acha, some hands are being raised. I can see from here.
I had a question for Amit. You had mentioned that the focus on climate change is in some ways distracting. And I wondered if you can elaborate on that, like in what ways, and could it also in some ways be a way to bring ecological issues into the discourse, even if some of these causes are not necessarily climate related?
Yeah.
Just before that, there's another comment.
Just briefly, I noted that Amit has a picture of a new class forming in some sense, potentially, or changing class structure within the tribal society. But I didn't hear from Vasavi so much about changes in class composition in the rural setting, or class caste composition. In fact, it felt as if you were presenting a picture of a rather of a traditional or pre-existing elite, which didn't seem to comport very well with shifting realities to my mind. So I wondered if you could, if you like, respond to that, but I think we may not have time. Thank you.
Vasavi, you could respond, but just make it brief. That's all.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I think the first part of my paper did flag the increasing differentiation. I talked about the caste class differentiation that has come in because of the form of adverse integration that you've had. The beneficiaries have primarily been the large farmers. And I also talk about how a little bit of the increased commercialization of agriculture has benefited landless laborers in those contexts where real wages have increased. For example, much of South India, real wages for rural workers has increased. But it is the middle ranking caste classes which are experiencing a lot of differentiation, which I did not elaborate on, but I have written about it. For example, it is the middle caste classes which are now investing very heavily into education or into investments in smaller towns and neighboring areas, who are also now trying to consolidate or get into larger holdings. And it is also among the what are called the service caste, the OBCs, that you are seeing a lot of churning out. They are now forming very big parts of the out-migration that we are seeing from the rural areas. And of course, the very small and marginal farmers to whom cultivation has become, a defeating. I mean, it's no longer economically viable. So you're seeing that they are now migrating out or even abandoning the land, or just becoming landless laborers, or selling the labor in the local towns and cities. So across the spectrum, we do see a lot of differentiation, but very sharply, it is the middle caste ranking caste and class. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, the issue about climate change. So it was, it was meant as more of a sort of a provocation, just to be, I think, for us to think a little bit more critically about that as a factor, because there's so much, emphasis on it, especially in mountainous and hill economies and so on. The amount of money that's coming in for that sort of thing is just so much that I think some of the more relevant, aspects or factors that affect, changes that we see at very local context may be very unrelated to, maybe related to other aspects. It has nothing to do with climate change. And so clearly, for instance, if it's Northeast, I can imagine that places like Arunachal Pradesh will have a direct, there will be consequences in terms of how, water levels are changing, or how, even cropping patterns might change. But I doubt if that's going to take place for, sort of the states that may be, let's say, below the Brahmaputra. Meghalaya and Mizoram and some of these places. I'm not entirely convinced with the climate change argument. I think there could be, it may play a role, there's no doubt, but I think we may be looking at something along the lines of a multiple regression or something along those lines. Multiple other factors also playing an equal role, if not more.
Well, thank you, Professor Bhaumik. Maybe you could close the session now.
Yes, yes. It is already 11:30, and the next session will start now. So I thank both the speakers, Dr. Kurian and Dr. Bhashavi, for very wonderful presentations, and also to the participants for their questions. So let us close this session here so that we can start next session on time. Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So now we begin our last session of this very interesting workshop. In this session, we have two speakers, Dr. Shahana Chattaraj, who is Director, WRI India, and she will be speaking on the paradox of planning in urban India. And we have Dr. Smita Srinivas, who's a researcher and specialist in innovation and industrial policy, Technical Change Lab. And she's going to talk about institutional variety in economic theory, implications for technological capabilities, and India's development. This session would be chaired by Shri Prem Chandravarkar, who is the managing partner, CNT Architects, Bangalore. We heard him give an excellent presentation yesterday. Prem Chandravarkar is the managing partner of CNT Architects, an award-winning and widely published architectural practice based in Bangalore, India. He is a former executive director of Shrishti Manipal Institute of Art, Design and Technology, and is an academic advisor and guest faculty at Indian and international colleges of architecture. Besides his design practice at CNT, he writes lectures and blogs on architecture, urbanism, philosophy, politics, education, environment, art, and cultural studies. Dr. Shahana Chattaraj is an interdisciplinary social scientist whose research and interest centers on urban political economy, policy, and governance in India and globally, as well as broader questions of development and urbanization. She holds a PhD from Princeton University in Public Affairs, a master's degree in international development, and a bachelor's in architecture from SPA New Delhi. Over the past 2 decades, Shahana has worked on urban planning, infrastructure and public services, urban and local governance, the informal economy, and comparative urban research policy. Ongoing projects focus on women's work in digital labor platforms and migration of migrant outcomes in cities, global and within India. Shahana has held research fellowships at Oxford and the Lauder Institute at the University of Pennsylvania. She has taught courses in public policy, urban studies, sociology and planning programs at Oxford University, the University of Pennsylvania, and Princeton prior to her doctoral studies. Shahana has worked for several years at the United Nations Population Fund in New York as a program coordinator and briefly as a consultant with the World Bank's Development Research Group. And Smita Srinivasan is a researcher, specialist, technological change lab. Smita studies economic development, its methods and philosophy with interests in evolutionary and institutional economics. She is a widely invited specialist in innovation and industrial policy on global concerns from energy to healthcare, skills to supply chain. Professor Srinivas was recognized as the 2021 Clarence E. Ayres Scholar in Institutional Economics from the Association for Evolutionary Economics, USA, and received the 2015 Joan Robinson Prize from the European Association for Evolutionary Political Economy for her book, Market Menagerie, Health and Development in Late Industrial States. She has held numerous full-time faculty visiting honorary professorial fellow or fellow appointments, including at the Open University UK, the Inogen Institute UCL, Columbia University, Harvard, IISc, NCBS, TIFR, and LSE, and other think tanks as well as expert groups. She holds a PhD from MIT in Economic Development and Technology Planning, fellowships from Harvard University's Kennedy School, and prior degrees in International Studies, Mathematics, and Physics. She's widely published, a frequent keynote and a public speaker, and serves journals on economics, innovation, and development. So now over to you, Prem, for handling the proceedings. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think we won't waste time and we'll jump straight into the presentations, half an hour each. So if I can request Shahana to start.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Ajit, for organizing this really interesting and diverse conference. It's an honor to be here and wonderful and a bit intimidating to share a platform with Smita. She has been a mentor and one of the people who actually got me thinking in a very different way about cities, development, the issues of planning, urban economies. So yeah, this is great to really share a platform with you, right? So my talk was called The Paradox of Planning in Urban India, and I think through the talk it will emerge, but I actually have, I'm going to focus on some of my own research that's related and a little less directly to issues of planning, because Prem and Champaka's presentation really covered a lot of the things that I would go into. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on issues of governance and how that links to the question of planning. What I'm going to do is present a concept about a concept of urban governance and the state in urban India and how it works. And it's linked to the idea of informality, which is pervasive in the economy as well as in cities in India. So it's called Informality and State Jugaad, how urban governance works in India. And then at the end, I'll try and go through this relatively quickly to talk about why we need new sorts of concepts and theorizations. As Prem had said, we lack an imagination of the city in India, but we also lack analytical categories and concepts and we know very little about Indian cities, even though we talk about how we're now an urban society and things. And there's an increasing interest, a lot of work on urban policy, on planning and things, but it's really in the absence of knowledge as such on the urban economy, on urban society, on what these changes actually mean for India. So the question I'm going to talk about is a piece of a larger research project, and it's trying to understand how states govern cities where informality in the economy and built environment is pervasive. And I'll talk later about why this should present a problem to governance. And I ended up using the concept of jugaad. I really didn't want to, and I came at it from a very different framework. But I think it actually becomes a really useful metaphor for the sorts of things I'm talking about. Because the concept, of course, it is actually a concept from the South, but it allows to pack in quite a lot of ambivalence and complexity in a concept. So, most of you here will know what jugaad means. It means cobbled together, making do, adaptation and improvisation under constraints, workarounds, and the term actually emerged from a vehicle, something that was actually cobbled together of different sorts of parts to meet a transport need. Now, the theory and literature that I draw on my work, so my background is a little, I started in architecture and then studied planning, but the disciplinary grounding, it's primarily in sociology and political science, but in fact, more of a political sociology lens within development and political science. And this is because I would say sociology is the discipline that has had probably the greatest interest and the most to say about cities and urbanization, but also that lens has been very Western focused, though it's a lot of how we think about cities has been based on these ideas and concepts. So what I found that existing theoretical frameworks and ways of thinking didn't really necessarily help me figure out a sort of framework through which to sort of understand and explain what I was observing, or the sorts of problems that were relevant to policy and development in India related to cities and urbanization. So I also drew on urban political economy, Indian political economy, state-society relations, work on states and state-society relations more broadly. Literature on the informal economy and the empirical work on Mumbai, because there's a lot of really excellent empirical work on Indian cities, not so much in terms of conceptual and theoretical work. One thing that's missing is the global South urban studies sort of work and concepts and literature, and I really don't find them useful at all. And I think there is a bit of a problem where there's only one lens that is allowed to speak to how we understand something as complex and varied and important to the economy and society as cities and urbanization. So this, I was saying, is part of a larger project, and I'm not going to delve into the comparative aspects. It started as a very kind of structured, hypothesis-driven comparative case study between Mumbai and Shanghai, and these kind of large-scale transformative projects, and one happened, was successful, the other one didn't, even though you had, and I was, the focus was going to be on issues of state capacity. Anyway, when I started doing my field work, I did start with that. And I think it's important to, when you analyze cities, to kind of be able to look across realms of governance. But I ended up spending a much longer time in Bombay and doing much more of the kind of much more urban ethnography grounded theorization. And that's where this jugaad governance idea comes up. And I think in some ways it ended up being the most useful part. I'm actually returning now to the more comparative aspects, because the work on China has actually also developed, and there's kind of interesting work on informality in China as well, and how the state deals with it. So, why am I focused on the informal economy? Well, a lot of us have talked here about the real economy versus abstractions of the economy. And as Barbara Harris-White said, it is the real economy. It's not a separate, non-accumulative needs sector. It's part of the dynamic, actually existing real economy in India, and a very, very large part. It's not just marginal. So it's while it's neither economically or politically marginal, informal economic activities operate in the margins of state regulatory institutions and formal bureaucratic structures. And that in general is how I'm talking about informal here. It is therefore, because it operates sort of outside of what the state is able to see and order and regulate, it's in large part illegible to the state. So here I'm talking about Scott seeing like a state, which I think a lot of you may know and is very foundational. And that illegibility makes it hard to order and control through the standard tools of bureaucratic governance and administration. And given the size and scope of the informal economy in Mumbai, I found that the accommodation and control of informal activities are a core task of urban governance in Mumbai, not in a marginal process at the edges of the state. Now, you have informal economies everywhere, including in the West. The first time I studied informalization and how the informal economy and how the state deals with it and some of these flexible practices was really in my ethnography fieldwork class, where I was looking at street vendors in New York, and they're actually at that level, there's similarities, but there it is a relatively marginal part of what the state's doing. Yeah, this is just, some things shows how highly mechanized, this is embroidery machines in Dharavi, right? This idea that it's this non-accumulative needs sector really doesn't hold true. There might be a tiny part, but most of it is not. In fact, it's, it's economic organization is not all that complex. I think if you take out the really dire living conditions and things, it could be any sort of an industrial cluster in many other places. I think the problem really is around the regulatory and planning environment around this that really makes it informal. So there's a lot of literature, and I'm drawing again on mostly the literature from sociology, and a lot of this has come up in the context of Latin America on informality in the state, but it's quite global, but not the urban informality in particular. So, some of this literature argues that the widespread informality in Mumbai and in many other cities, economic as well as in the built environment, is a product of the mismatch between the state's formal institutional regulatory structure. So these include things like the master plans, municipal regulations, what you're allowed to do and not do in certain spaces, and the organization of the urban political economy. And then this informal economy, because of that, is defined by this vexed relationship with the state. It is useful for states with limited capacity and will for enforcement of rules and regulation, and also in some ways a limited capacity to actually fulfill their welfare obligations and things to allow it to operate. But this is a kind of, it's not a consistent relationship, because the state also alternately curbs, formalizes, ignores, accommodates, and collaborates in informal economic activities. And then there are also periods where there are periodic crackdowns and enforcement drives to demonstrate state power to maintain order and rule of law. Given that, we're saying that there is this kind of very complex sort of relationship, jugaad became a useful word as a metaphor, first because of this whole emphasis on theorizing from the South. And I'm trying to talk about practices that are embedded in certain well, I guess if jugaad is a pervasive practice within India. So in some ways you can see how it would ultimately be part of state practices as well as practices of, say, regular citizens and firms and businesses. Now, generally in most of the literature that you've seen on jugaad, it comes from certain type of school of management, some work on industrial organization and things. In those, the state is, and then there's work on how slum dwellers have jugaad and like young people in cities have jugaad and things. Some of it is a very literal use of the word. It's not really doing much work as a concept. But yeah, and a lot of the, say, the firm literature on frugal innovation and all of that, or on slum dwellers using jugaad, the idea is that the state is either the foil, so there's this rigid bureaucratic state, and that works in a particular way, and then firms and businesses and people work in these much more flexible improvised sort of fashions. And then there's also an idea that it's the jugaad comes up because of the state's failure to actually provide proper infrastructure and services. That's why they have to improvise and have workarounds and things. So it's not typically used in the context of the state. Now, as I said, this kind of emerged, this is a ground up sort of conceptualization. And because I started observing these sorts of and hearing about these sorts of practices in multiple domains of policy in the city. So from the regulation of street vending and informal business activities, there's a lot of other literature on this as well. Production, servicing, and regularization of informal and unauthorized settlements and housing. It's another thing where there's quite a bit of work. One really interesting area is around property tax collection from unauthorized structures, and how the state, which is kind of forced to provide all sorts of services and regulation in areas that are not part of the plan, and that it doesn't, it's not officially meant to say tax, and that are not technically in the tax and policy net. How does it actually raise the funds for it to be able to govern these areas? So that's a really interesting area that I think a lot more work needs to be done on. There's a real gap on literature and analysis on public finance aspects of governance, which is a very central issue when it comes to urban governance. And then when it comes to issues of policing and surveillance and social control. Right? What is Jugaad governance? It involves in all of these areas. It involves negotiations, bargains, accommodations around the state's framework of law, statutes, rules, and standards and protocols that regulate how citizens and firms occupy and utilize space, conduct business, and access public resources and services. These sorts of practices that go on in long-term systemic ways and establish sort of informal rules and institutions that govern different sorts of sectors and activities, they end up embedding state actors within informal power structures, and there's an informal delegation of power and authority. These processes or practices enable the state to maintain social control and oversight, extract revenues, satisfy popular demands, and avoid the political, administrative, and financial costs that would be associated with strict rule enforcement. They end up in increasing state society interpenetration, and partially over time, partially and very unequally incorporate informal spaces within formal state institutions. State actors, this is really important, that this isn't just like a frontline bureaucrats or vernacular levels of the state sort of argument. State actors at different levels apply these improvised, contingent, politically negotiated practices and strategies of governance or regulation, and these are at variance with official rules and procedures in order to intervene in informal spaces, whether they're economies and economic activities or settlements that are illegible to the formal state. These practices are neither strictly informal or formal or informal. It's quite hard to say actually whether a practice is formal or informal, but they're an adaptive, but they are built around the actual structure of rules. Right? They're not just say, that having that structure of rules is really important, because once I started doing work in other cities which are not as institutionalized, or we don't have as strong, say, administrative capacity as in Mumbai, and there is no, in some ways, there's no structure of rules at all that anyone recognizes, you wouldn't really call it a Jugaad thing, right? It's much more of a different sort of governance system, if there is one. And this is another really important point here, is that this is not, yes, of course, there's a lot of corruption and rent seeking and clientelism associated with this. And again, there's a lot of literature around this. But again, what's different is that it's not merely corrupt or rent seeking, it's actually doing work in governance. And nor are these irrational acts of vernacular lower bureaucracy. So in the Indian political economy literature, there's an idea that you have like good rule following Weberian IAS officers at the top, and at the bottom you have vernacular identity, clan-based sort of lower level state actors who don't really understand policies and processes. But certainly in places like Mumbai, it's very different, right? Most state actors have a very rational policy goal-related explanation for why they're doing what they're doing and why they're working around rules. And it's geared towards realizing state functions and objectives under the constraints of this incongruous legal regulatory framework and limited state power and capacity. These are just some examples from interviews and things. So they talk about how plots get encroached, there's involvement of politicians and officials, you have these illegal things, undesirable transactions, and the matter is settled. All you're required to do is ignore it. The status keeps shifting. You manage to construct something and stay for a few years. They get semi-authorized, tolerated, and additional slums are brought under toleration. So toleration is not an official category, but it still works as a category. And after all, an elected representative is expected to look after voters. So the elected representatives have very little formal role in most of these decision-making and administrative processes. So this is something about water, right? Where, so there's some really good work on how the state kind of negotiates and works around the need to, you have to give water, right? That's a basic necessity everywhere, even in areas and settlements which are illegal, and then also make sure that it's actually able to plan a water system. And that kind of jugaad system it's really being overstretched in some ways. So what happens in a jugaad state? It sort of seeing somewhat like a state. The jugaad state sees the city partially and intermittently, lacking the God's eye view on which rational administration and planning is premised. So Prem had talked about what master plans seek to do. And it's quite absurd if you read it. Like the Delhi master plan says that its purpose is to lay out all the space and infrastructure requirements for all of the social and economic activities of the city for the next 20 years. It's like, how is it even possible to do that? Even if you had the best data in the world, that would be pretty impossible. But this is in a case where you have almost no data, right? Where 90% of, work is informal, most of the building activity is informal. And this is not an indicative plan. This is really deterministic, it's statutory, right? You can actually, it is legally enforceable as well. But at the same time, what happens through this process is that the horizontal embeddedness of state actors in local power structures, it fragments centralized and hierarchical authority structures and dissipates state power. So you have this weird thing where you have extremely centralized formal authority plans and projects, and then you have a state that's much more internally fragmented. And so you have this thing where you have, it's almost like a kind of centralization without power in the sense of infrastructural power. So you have these constant, I think a constant theme is very grandiose, ambitious central projects like making Mumbai into Shanghai, building 100 smart cities. And at the end of it, they constantly fail. And then this whole, say that the typical neoliberalism governmentality sort of urban literature doesn't really explain it well. And it kind of comes up with this very hard to explain idea that somehow this was the state's plan all along, right? That it didn't really want to make Shanghai, Mumbai, or build Dholera or whatever. And that it somehow is, fulfilling some intentional desire in all of this. Now, so what these strategies end up doing is weaken organizational coherence. And then the other thing is that institutional knowledge inheres in the individual. So this also makes like the state kind of gets in some ways more and more blind to the officially. In reality, people know what's there, but in terms of the paperwork and the data that it uses to make decisions, it gets kind of more and more blind over time in some ways. And of course, there are these internal and external pushes for administrative discipline and rule enforcement. So these jugaad kind of practices sort of work till they don't. And there's an eviction or enforcement or a drive to enforce rules and things. So this is kind of an illustration of, jugaad is like this cobbling together of things that don't necessarily fit together very well. And there's a real difference in the logic, say, of this flexible, networked, informal sort of governance strategies that the state actually uses. And this kind of like the bureaucratic logic, the logic around which the state is formally organized, which is very sector, it's in sectors, departments. Planning, in fact, is not even, it's a separate department. It's not just, it's not kind of a coordinating mechanism and things. What is the jugaad state? If I start using it as thinking of a way in which states in India operate or a characterization, it's defined as much as by centralized insulated formal institutions and by its modernizing ambitions as by its flexible, negotiated and improvised governance practice. The concept reframes these sorts of practices as more than just corruption and clientelism. So I have another paper which kind of talks about the work these, and it's, it's framed around rent seeking and rent distribution, but saying that they actually do work in governance in Mumbai, while capturing inherent tensions and contradictions within the state. So I think it's sort of explaining also why it's able to do some things relatively well given the situation, but it's also not able to carry out large scale projects, but it's also in some ways, and this becomes important now, I think, with issues of climate change. When I was doing this work, I was like, well, it doesn't really matter. Planning's really not doing much. It's not relevant in any way, this kind of spatial urban planning. But I think now when climate change is such a serious concern and these weaknesses, I think, do really matter. And I also say that it exerts power not by making the exception, but by selectively enforcing the rule. This is because another framework that's often used to explain how the state works in Indian cities is the state of exemption. How does this say, why do I think this is more useful compared to other sorts of theoretical frameworks that have been used? There's actually existing neoliberalism. When I started and I wrote up my proposal, I had neoliberalism everywhere, and then I cut it out because it's really not remotely useful. And this actually existing, it's a real cop-out, right? It's like, oh, okay, neoliberalism still explains everything, and everything it doesn't, which is almost everything, I'm going to put in actually existing. Then there's a state of exception and informalization of the state. One of the things is like, where is the exception when everything is an exception? It is really the selective rule enforcement, I think, that becomes more important in this context, and what drives it exactly. What happens to formal state power and authority? As I said, they had this very inexplicable idea that centralized bureaucratic state was, that would be a real, which they haven't explored, that if it's somehow ultimately always doing what it wants, how does it actually do this, right? Given what I said about how the state cannot see anymore. So I say that it exerts power by selectively enforcing the rule. And then there's this assemblage, bricolage, whatever, which again, it's like, it's very hard to disagree with. I'm sure, cities are a bricolage, but I don't see that it gives us much analytical weight. We can't use it to begin to say, move forward and think of institutional variety and pluralism, why we have these different sorts of variation. So within institutions. So this study was in Mumbai, but after that I went on to do work in Gujarat and UP around planning, and you see Gujarat and UP were almost as different as India and China in terms of state capacity and institutions. So there's, I think, one constant theme here has been the amount of variation we have in India, right? Both in terms of economy and society, but also state policies, institutions, capacities, and things. So a lot of these, the existing theorizations don't really help us understand or explain that, or even look at that, right? They kind of, they are in their own ways universalizing frameworks. So what are the questions and implications that, well, the Jugaad state, as I said, governs after fashion, but it lacks the ability to undertake long-term planning or meet societal and policy goals in a systemic, coordinated, even a fair way, right? Because it becomes very, dependent on which communities have access to political power, how competitive elections are. All those things actually end up affecting that. But I think this lens becomes useful to start, say, doing more comparative research across India to see how does, say, variations in the political structure or social structure end up affecting either outcomes or governance practices and things. Then you also have this case where governance reformers call for transparent, consistent, and strict rule enforcement, depoliticization of state policy. And without whole-scale democratization and transformation of the formal rules and information, reforms that are mainly meant to like kind of take politics out and strictly inform laws and zoning practices and all, they are likely to have anti-poor implications. The poor in Indian cities tend to access the state through local politics and intermediation. Then I think another question that emerges is, and I think this is a really relevant one, does the Jugaad state's ability to incorporate informal groups preclude broad-based political mobilization and resistance or kind of reforms? When are Jugaad strategies tolerated and formalized, and when are they curbed, actively restricted? So that first question, so a lot of the other thing is, I think this is sort of an imagined resistance. A lot of the urban studies people like to talk about resistance, but there really isn't. And if there is that resistance, it's not how they imagine it. It's not a broad-based class resistance in any way whatsoever, right? Even when it's resistance, some of it is really like to very basic things like sealing of their businesses and threatening their livelihoods. Or there's, say, in the case of, say, the Dharavi project and things, right? A lot of the resistance was around how the state, with this, again, very universal formula, when it was redeveloping, the idea is that everyone that doesn't recognize, say, the rental market there, that there are landlords. It's a huge variation in incomes and things within that. And they wanted to give standardize, right, the same size of house plot to every person. And of course, the larger landowners and all who are renting out land to huge factories, that makes no sense for them. So a lot of the resistance was really negotiation around this. It wasn't a kind of, the sort of class-based resistance that people like to imagine in cities. And the other question, of course, and I think this, Champaka may be able to speak to this a bit more, is since she's worked on smart cities, is Jugaad an enduring feature of urban governance in India? Or will the states push for formalization, corporatization, new surveillance technologies? Like India is now the third most surveilled country in the world, things like Aadhaar and all, like it makes us all very, and I think that has been a big change from when I was doing my work. We're all very visible to the state at all times. So how do these reshape the state's relationship with the informal city? I don't know. So I'll end here with, thinking about why we need new concepts and theorizations. I've sort of gone over some of these. One of the things is, if you read the urban literature on China or Latin America, the US, it would be quite unthinkable to imagine that what's going on in cities can be explained without any reference to their, their actual, the main social cleavages would be race in America, caste here, class in India as well, caste and class, religion. Then and also, of course, like the institutions of the state, governance, like a fundamental thing that we do not have. Cities are not, they're not political entities in India. They are very politicized, but they don't. So you'll see so much stuff. And then you have a lot of, there's a huge interest now in urban policy. And a lot of that, the basic premise begins with having mayors. I saw that you had, in Champaka, in your thing, they had something about mayors. I was like, mayors are not relevant, right? Like so the premises of a lot of the policy recommendations also don't make sense. So I'll end here with, arguing that we need.
Thank you, Shahana.
So first of all, a very, very big thank you to colleagues at Adri for not just the invitation. Can you all hear me in the back? Yeah, all right. Not just the invitation to have us here, but also the sort of the graciousness and the open-ended conversations that we've had with many of you have really been a pleasure. So thank you so much for having us here, and for Ajit to have equally kind of whipped, corralled, brought us all together in a good way so we can meet. So in the conversations over the last 2 days, we've really tried to not only take on some of the big issues that we think allow us to have a conversation about dynamics and change, but also we are all thinking as disciplinarians, right? We come from our own professions and disciplines, and we are trying to think of ways to contribute, to give back, to open up conversations. So I would say one provocation for all of us in these 2 days is not just that we come together as interdisciplinary groups, but that we also try and think about in our own disciplines how we create some momentum for change. Because those insights that come from interdisciplinary conversations are precisely the ones that we think are kind of progressive tides that could inform something that is quite static in our own discipline. So that's sort of the spirit of the talk. And as you probably got from my bio, I focus a lot on technological capabilities. I'm interested in the dynamics of what is changing in different places. Why are some places more successful at some moments in time? It obviously has huge implications for not just supply chains, but for people's work, their abilities to find work, to learn new skills, to have a sense of engagement with the work that they do, and so on. So it was quite interesting hearing Shahana's talk, because I began, I think, my career way back when, working on the informal economy. So in today's talk, very briefly, the issues of what and why do we care about this issue of institutional variety? What does it really mean? And then I'm going to very quickly come to 2 arguments that I won't lay out in full. You can go and read some of my work. But I want to take the conversation today a little bit into methodology. Because we have seen some of the early papers in the 2 days have talked at 30,000 feet, and some of the papers have talked at the very granular level. And we need to meet also somewhere in between, where we are able to say, how could our disciplines move? We're not going to transform our disciplines, but we want to have a conversation about change. So, and then I'll just give you some quick examples that we'll work through. Now, over the last 2 days, what we have done in different ways is really done some storytelling. People have done that storytelling through graphs. People have done that storytelling through visual to photographs. Some people have done it through animated change in structure over time. And the idea of this storytelling, which we all do, and Deirdre McCloskey says it very well. By the way, that's a great book. If you're so smart, it's a really fun, very thin, very readable book. Is we all tell stories about some transformation that has taken place. And the reality is, even when we say something has not changed very much, we all acknowledge that some change has taken place. And the question is, how big is that change? How would we know? Now, the issue of institutions and institutional variety in economics has become a kind of a very uncomfortable story. It's partly because we are all trained differently in economics, and we come from different sort of broad schools. And my idea is really not to compare what you call heterodox with mainstream economics. That has never been my fight. These are all abstractions. They're useful to have irrespective. My question really is a little bit more, how do you argue within the paradigm you're in? I'm not interested in a fight and say, those mainstreamers over there, or those crazy heterodox people over there. The question is, within your paradigm, how is it that your argument changes? And as you know, institutions could be defined on the one hand as customs, norms, rules, guidelines, regulations, and also, of course, legislation, acts of law. But that spectrum in institutional economics is a deeply contested one. And there are many areas of economics that require us to really kind of step back and clarify what we are saying. So while we all look at each other and broadly nod and say, I understand what you're saying, the reality is that the units of analysis we use to describe change and dynamism in the economy actually is largely framed by what kind of economics training we've had. So when we do, let's say, a randomized control trial, or we look at, say, game theory, or we look at a behavioral economic study of some kind, or we do a more ethnographic study, or we use secondary data entirely, we're making strong assumptions about inference and judgment in economics that are very rarely actually taught in the classroom. And even more rarely do most economists do field work. So actually what happens, in fact, at Adri, you're very lucky in that a lot of your work goes back and forth with projects. So you are forced to confront how much of what you learned is viable or not. But in this kind of quick map that I've done here, the conceptual map, we really have tensions between what you would call, and I think Sanjay referred to as sort of this body of growth theory. In development economics, you have a kind of question of how much variety of these institutions, norms, rules, customs, guidelines, standards do we care about or describe? Do we only describe them in the aggregate? And in evolutionary economics, this actually becomes a very important question because, as many of you know, in evolutionary economics, dynamism is at the center of the premise of the population group you are studying. You assume that the relationship to the population group, whether you're studying firms or workers or something, there is a kind of a variation. Then there's what you call selection. Selection could be the policy environment that acts. And then you see a retention or a replication, depending on what you use for R. So VSR describes the change that occurs in that system. Now, you have new institutional economics, you have varieties of capitalism, you have French Régulation school, you have neo-Schumpeterians, you have what you call the original American institutionalism. And each of them within the body of institutional economics, within paradigm, still see quite a lot of contestation about units of analysis. So when you think of economics as a science, the reason I insist on the within paradigm is because you want it to progress like a science with some understanding, common understanding of what you're studying. And these people up here are not good-looking faces just for the sake of them. These are people who are actually studying technological capabilities in very different ways within the broader tradition of institutional economics. And how many of you can recognize at least 5 of them? Okay, I'll leave that for you to discuss later, but it is very important. There's at least, I think, one Bihari here, but there's a question of how you piece the units of analysis and you study technological capabilities. And the articulation of those technological capabilities over time tells us the broad question: how is India the same as China? How is India different from Nigeria? How is Karnataka the same as Bihar, and so on? So when we talk about the practicalities then, not the theoretical differences, but the practicalities, there are very clear problems with how we look at the development of technological capabilities over time. One is, of course, that industrialized economies and what they consider to be the Chandlerian firm, right? The Chandler describes a type of R&D embedded in a firm where there are metrics and manuals already set out for us to fit in. This is a real problem. So when we talk about the startup economy, we talk about large industrial firms, we talk about capitalization, we're really referring to the Frascati and the Oslo manuals, which already exist to study these things, largely serving industrialized economies. At the same time, because we understand that change is underway, we can actually track some of these changes in quite practical ways. And the rest of my talk will focus on some of these little insights about how you could do this. So the SDGs are, say, the broad cover. but you would have some guideline that says eat less meat, which is a kind of a policy imperative. Then you might ask yourself, are there other ways in which we could be healthy besides just following some principle about diet? And so I've given you this the National Cancer Grid, which is actually a new way. And actually, the National Cancer Grid, I would argue, is probably since we're talking about the next 3 decades, one of the things that will completely transform Indian healthcare. And it's really worth watching because it is redefining the standards, protocols, the procurement mechanisms, the technical guidelines, and the technologies involved in routinized cancer care. So if I had to put my bets on the kinds of things that we will see coming, the study of this type of institutional change is very, very important. What are the new ways in which standardization will come about? And then the example here is the Jaipur Foot, which is a classic example of something that did not come out of an R&D firm, but is a kind of a global, a world-changing innovation. All of you have heard of the Jaipur Foot, but you probably haven't realized the extent to which it is actually the dominant prosthetic around the world. And it is not just something that is for poor people. This is for something that is actually highly material specific. It's an extremely adaptable, very complex innovation that has come from a nonprofit that has brought it into existence. And why we care about it is it's customized, it's local, it's specific to being able to sit cross-legged in India. You need to climb over things, you need to do things that no prosthetic around the world can do. So when we think about technological capabilities, we really have to think of it in this context. So very broadly, we tell this big story of the Index of Human Development. Let's just say where South Korea, India, you have all of these countries. But in reality, we're looking at sets of industries and particular skills and capabilities that have transformed these countries over time. So you could hypothesize, for example, that one of the dominant ways in which these countries and their trajectories could be explained has nothing to do with capitalism in the abstract. It actually has to do with the structure of the chemical industry value chain. And if you look at industry studies, it is a large determinant of the outcomes of these countries because they have a knock-on effect on so many industries. So that guess is as good as any other guess about how these countries changed over time. So if you wanted to have very pure products, but you didn't want to end up in, I don't know if I have a pointer that does much, but you want to end up in products that affect your food supply chain, you could end up in the picture at the bottom right, which is actually how much palm oil is embedded in every food product and the clusters of food products. So this kind of perspective where you look at change by the products, the skills, the technologies involved, and the sub-industries gives you actually a very good sense of what is changing on the ground. And why this is important is that it pushes away from convergence studies. It allows us to understand that fundamentally a dynamic of change is non-convergent. There's a great deal of variety in the system. So this should not surprise you because when you look at the so-called East Asian miracle from an industry standpoint, in fact, all you see, despite all the rhetoric, all you see is actually this institutional variety. So if you look at Hong Kong to South Korea, you don't see one model. You actually see many models of the institutional bundles and the recombining that allowed labor, land, or other assets to be used. And in some work I've done, I have objected to the idea of the so-called global south because I think it's quite a useless phrase, G20 and all our discussions notwithstanding. So argument one really is to say that economics, to put it politely, has some confusion about institutional variety and how it analyzes it
within the paradigms that we are discussing. You don't need to talk across paradigm, but within the paradigms itself, there's a lot of confusion. And then the second argument is once you have and you recognize this high institutional variety, it's very hard to make an argument that there is some solidaristic global south in economic development. All right. Now, very quickly, in the interests of time, I'm going to go across some examples to give you a sense of how population studies and single case studies or nested case study design can give us some bridge to actually do the work of economic analysis. Amit, for example, discussed some of the climate change as well as the sort of zoonosis and other challenges. We really do have some need to get into complexity of cases without wanting everything to be nice, clean, and causal. So in the population studies versus cases, this is a slightly more philosophical slide. I can come back to it, but economics does not behave as a science. There's enough evidence to indicate that economics does not act as a science for all kinds of good reasons. The problem with a lot of industry methods within paradigm is that these history-friendly models are really single industry and few countries. This causes additional problems for us in economics. And then in evolutionary economics, there are lots of these problems of building blocks of the formal models. And if you hold the selection environment constant, you end up with certain kinds of study challenges. In evolutionary and institutional economics, you also have certain kinds of opportunities of mixing, for example, game theory with social network analysis in ways that are extremely fruitful from a methodology standpoint. And catch-up studies of industrial development, for example, are really plagued by ex-post analysis. So once they kind of cross the selection barrier and they are on the R side of VSR, then they're seen as somehow a success, and we study them, but we don't have an explanation. And you have a lot of within neo-Schumpeterian schools that use Schumpeter, you end up with problems associated with cohesion. So broadly speaking, there are some kind of Boolean algebra and combinatorial opportunities to do analysis. And it's really important, therefore, that you take case selection very, very carefully. So I'm just laying out two, but there could be many other types of these sort of qualitative heuristics, which lend themselves to a way of sorting the taxonomy of the firm or the product or the particular innovation you're studying. But they also allow you to kind of convert these into game theoretical, social network analysis, cluster models, and so on. So the heuristic is a way to think through the starting point of your study, but it is also a way to consider how your population is, your population of firms, for example, or products, is populated into the heuristic. So I can come back to this in a bit, but why the one on the left side really is a way for us to think about relational attributes of trade between countries. So the upper left-hand quadrant is the dominant way we study economics, which is global supply chains, and then minor modifications through technology transfer. But in fact, a lot of things we care about for developing countries or within India or across our states actually lies in the off-diagonal elements here. So it is worth considering that our policy effort is quite misplaced. The right side is a kind of a more of a co-evolutionary paradigm, which I've used the health industry, but you could use it for energy, for example. And what you are trying to do is understand which countries actually begin with the dominant policy emphasis in a specific institutional combination. And again, this is agnostic to what you think should be. What you're trying to understand is what is. All right, this relates a little bit to what Shahana was pointing out as well, which is we try to hide too much under theoretical rubrics. There's actually a methodological question that should lead us, which is how do we know what we're seeing? So here's an example where I talk about these 4 C's, while so much of convergence studies, such as manufacturing value addition or other measurements or R&D investments comes from the convergence paradigm, we are really interested in trying to understand how do you move between these quadrants, which countries begin in what quadrant, and how does this as a snapshot over time change? So if you begin with an investment, let's say today in electric vehicles, how is it that different countries have begun or playing out this, if you like, this game or this thought experiment? How does this actually correlate with reality? So I will give you some very quick examples in the remaining time. You can run this and look at actual vaccines. Vaccines are a great case. I do a lot of consulting and advisory work with different types of firms, so I see these problems. But here was an example with the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative. If you actually look and classify, you don't need ideology to discuss what kind of vaccine you need or how it comes about. You can also say, how did it come about in a history? And we can have a clear answer. How did it come about? Obviously, the science affects us, right? So here you have that there is, for example, coordination by a nonprofit has only been in 1 case in all the first licensures of vaccines to date. So that means from a population and evolutionary economic standpoint, you really do have sets of questions about the number of vaccines you wanted to look at in your sample to begin with. And a lot of the politics of COVID, for example, relates to the right-hand column here of the kinds of questions. How do you leave out large failed candidates? What kinds of norms are acceptable in the selection of your design? And how did you, for example, do policy-induced acceleration, right? So here's an example of how you are concerned with the methodology first approach to understanding that change is already underway, and then use it to consider how research design should be done. You could do this for morphine. We've been looking at morphine availability. And if you look at this map, you see the absurd relations of how much morphine is actually available for populations that don't need it for palliation. So this disproportionate graph, this blown up thing, is associated with how much morphine per capita is available for actual people in pain who need it, right? It's a very disturbing graph. Or you could use this to understand cancer innovations that are underway in India. And this is agnostic about capital intensive, labor intensive. This is simply asking the question of what is already here. And in that sense, it's an optimistic picture. So instead of doing this sort of graph, which says, how did heterogeneity and recovery happen in selected industries during COVID, which this is a good first place to begin. You can do the same by industry. In fact, we were part of this study. And you can look at those industries affected more or less, but consider doing something a little different, which is you want to start actually understanding what countries did. And if you look at this, I don't expect you to be able to read it, but this is on COVID diagnostic kits, and you see very unexpected places doing a lot better than you think. And this is using that heuristic as a way to actually say what happened, who began when, and how fast did they do it. That's a very simple way of understanding technological capabilities in a time of crisis. And it's a good experiment. It's a good natural experiment, right? Trade was closed, lockdown was in place. There's a way to study it. Similarly, for oxygen, I won't go into this. This is available online. You can take a look at this. In some ways, it's a very optimistic story. Extraordinary changes occurring in very short periods of time. I'm not denying the tragedies that happened, but it's a way to try and understand what and how dynamic some places have been. And we are living in a country with extraordinary dynamism, and we are not able to capture it because we have a kind of a mismatch between the type of evidence we are seeking and the nature of the theories that inform this change. And in fact, Ajit and I and others have been trying to talk about how a much more dynamic approach to economics would serve us well in designing studies that capture this change on the ground. I was involved in some of the shifts in the Ayurveda challenges. Remember, both oxygen and Ayurveda were very high demand, high uncertainty cases. And you had to change multiple industries to do oxygen availability, right? It wasn't a single case. Ayurveda has different kinds of issues, and here are some of them from a customs, norms, standards, regulation perspective. You have a whole host of industries that are on the input and output sides, and you also have very different kinds of considerations of what is considered traditional versus industrial. So I'll just walk through these. Similarly, in organizational variety, which is part of the institutional variety kind of framework, you have these modern manufacturing firms, family-linked production cooperatives, farms and nurseries. And this raises some very practical questions for how we tend to do industrial policy. And you could do the same comparisons across standardization, where there are overlapping areas between generic pharma and Ayurveda, and then a whole host of difference. Many people are using this institutional variety framework to actually do work on energy as well. So culture is sort of the last bastion. I won't get into it, but I'm satisfied that I put the Kantara poster up. Go see Kantara. The Meiji restoration, the Reformation that took place in Japan was the big change of culture. And we're having a similar discussion in India about how to be much more responsive to different cultures. And the Kadlekai Parishe in Karnataka, in Bangalore in particular, is a huge set of a transformation of the economy around peanuts. But we don't really build industrial policies around the calendar for agricultural produce in a way that is convergent, because we are focused so much on supply chains of other kinds. And the cultural question, I think, is especially important. So rather than convergent studies, I think we have to be agile, and this is really my last slide, to think about, and I've talked about this elsewhere, studies that are concerned with cohesion. How do we hold things together that are already there? How do we think about customization for our economies? And there is a kind of a cognitive, behavioral economics, psychology, anthropological or other lens, which has to do with those mental models, right? You can agree that everyone from Douglas North to Clarence Ayres to Sanjay Lal they were all interested in the cognitive question. Why are certain innovations more responsive in our economies? And I think we have to come back to that dynamic. So I'm going to leave it here, which is they have very practical implications for us. Which metrics we push, what kinds of indices we use, how we can restructure the relationship a little bit with the kinds of money we get for our studies and how we push back gently or otherwise. And I actually am a great optimist. I think the next 30 years of change is already here for us. We just haven't mapped how much of that change is affecting people's lives. And I think some of the political questions can be understood a little bit by viewing these sub-industries, technologies, products, and services, because they are changing how people live and work. So these are the kinds of things we do at the Technological Change Lab. Obviously, I'm both academic as well as applied, but I think we are in an optimistic scenario. And I really want to thank Adri again for having us all here and a chance for exchange. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to claim moderator's privileges and raise the first two questions, and then I'll open it up and we'll bunch the questions. Shahana, a question to you. There was a report recently by the legal think tank Vidhi. It said that in India, we don't have rule of law, we have rule by law. And in rule of law, the state can retreat into the background, but rule by law demands the state's presence and intervention on a daily basis. So from that point of view, perhaps the Jugaad state is actually deliberate. The state likes it that way. So if we look at an alternative, the challenge is that law doesn't handle complexity very well. It can deal with either or questions much easier and not complex issues. So from that perspective, I'm going to throw back the question you asked me yesterday, what do you want planning to achieve? And Smita, I see parallels between what you were saying and what Roger Martin writes about as the capacity for opposable minds, that humans have evolved because we have opposable thumbs and then therefore can grasp a tool to extend our capabilities. So effective policy, organizations, etc., encourage opposable minds. But that requires a certain reflective ability. And in Martin's case, it's easy because he's talking about business management. So he talks about the reflective ability of the CEO. But in economic policy, how do we build in that reflective ability, especially since it tends to be outsourced to think tanks, etc. Whereas this maybe needs a more dynamic in-house capability. So with that, I'll open it up to questions. Yeah, one up.
Good afternoon, one and all. I am Manoj Prabhakar from Patna University. Governance you prefer? Number two, how to address the problem of slum in Indian cities? Thank you.
Well, thank you, both Dr. Chhatral and Dr. Srinivas for brilliant lectures. My question for Dr. Chhatral is that, do you see some hope in improvement of urban governance in charter cities, a project which has been initiated by economist Paul Romer? So can you throw some light on charter cities? And my question for Dr. Srinivas is, the holy grail of economics has been why certain areas are more developed than others. But this has been going on for the past 300 years. So earlier we had emphasis on capital formation, savings and all those things, and developed various models around them. Then Harvard historian David Landis very famously recorded in his book, The Wealth and Poverty of Nations, that and at the end of the day, it is culture that matters. Now then we have Jared Diamond, who emphasizes geography. And now we have a place from where you did your PhD work, MIT. Doran Ashmoglu and James Robinson, their book, Why Poverty, Why Nation Fails. They have given this institutional verdict, but extending the work of Douglas North, that the rules of the game that ultimately decides, the prosperity or poverty of regions. So I'm talking in a larger framework, which you emphasize in the very beginning, that either you can talk in a granular level or at the very. So can you please tell us something about this? So because kindly throw some light on all these things. Where are we right now at least? When you're doing analysis at the micro level, because as in your lecture you pointed out, we also have RCTs, which is very micro level work. Then we also have some very big level work going on. So can you please throw some light on all those things? And finally, economics becoming a science, I think that began from Paul Samuelson, if I'm right, that extreme mathematization of we're using a lot of math in economics, So some people have also objected to that because of course, it is for development and everything, but when you're doing a lot of maths in economics, are you not somehow missing the human touch which has been offered by, say, Adam Smith or say Alfred Marshall? Thank you.
Questions?
I have a question for Smita, which is it is a point of clarification basically. From what I gathered from your presentation is probably that you are suggesting that technological change should be studied in a way as explainers of various things like changes in social norms, cultures, and politics. So are you looking at it as a causal effect of affecting these changes, or do you think that it is kind of a cyclical process that is happening?
Thank you, Smita and Shahana, for excellent presentations. So much to think about. And I've been hugely inspired by you both, as well as had long-standing discussions over the years. I have a question for both of you. How would you situate exclusion and inclusion, particularly exclusion, as part of the Jugaad state, or as part of concepts that Smita invoked in the form of cohesion, customization, cognition, and co-evolution that I discussed yesterday, drawing on Smita's work? How would you situate exclusionary processes in these concepts that you discussed today? Thank you.
This is really not a question, it's a bit of a loud thinking on my own part. Basically, I'm interested in what Smita called method, absolutely. That's very important. Although we are never explicit between paradigms and so on, what those methodologies are and their consequences for explanation. Suppose I take this thing about informality that Shahana raised and use that as a testing ground for the methodological considerations perhaps all of us have in mind. Now, just by sheer size of the workforce, India's labor force, as of 1991, when macroeconomic reform so-called began operating in India, the size of the informal workforce was reckoned at 90%. Paradoxically, after the reforms, we would have expected that to reduce. In fact, it has actually increased. Now people place it, the size of the informal sector, in terms of labor, to 95% or upwards of it. Now, given this thing, once we, the way the language, formality is the rule, informality is the residual and exception, throws the whole majority into theoretically a minority, into a black box, right? And we know that within the so-called informality, there are varieties of institutional or organizational structures and so on. I remember we had this sociologist from Bombay some years ago, I think he passed away, Sharit Bhaumik, who actually told us how some of the high-end upper middle class consumer goods are actually made in Dharavi and other slums of Bombay. Hair soaps and designer clothes and all that stuff. So how do we look at this? Do we look at this formal, informal in terms of binaries or in terms of a dualism? Or do we look at them in terms of asymmetry rather than dualism? And once you peek into this vast sea of so-called informality, how do we conceptualize? I mean, it's true that ultimately all social theory, and economics cannot be an exception, must deal with change, understand change, at least historical change, and at least exposed, if not, predict the future. Then it must also do so consistently without, spoiling the rules of, getting too much into ad hocism and throwaway kind of thing. And for which you also need concepts which have measures, in the sense, without measurability, the phenomena on which a concept is built is not observable. And therefore, you cannot explain, you cannot put it, and so on. For the rest, all institutionalists, Schumpeter, everybody is interested in dynamism. To me, it appears that the one methodological point, there is a methodology concerning structure, the methodology concerning change. I suppose when it comes to methodology of change, understanding change, the Gunnar Miedel's concept of circular and cumulative causation seems to be very, very promising, and in a way has been tested or followed even by applied economists. Nicholas Calder, who until the 50s and early 60s was really occupied with abstract models of growth built on Keynesian foundations. Later on, he got disillusioned and gave them up and went to the empirics and said, what you call stylized facts, and tried to, so that is the observable regularities of reality. And then build models or frameworks and so on. Very simple, but very models that would inform, etc. So taking formality and informality, how would you both reflect quickly? I'm not expecting that we will resolve this in the next few minutes, but at least something to take home back.
So this is for Shahana, very similar. Urban governance today is dependent mostly on, outsourcing. And why urban governance? Even institutions, For instance, I work in a college and most of the services are outsourced. So this outsourcing is also informality, I would say. So you have informality intruding inside formality. I mean, everyone's talked about it. I just want to know, would you call this formal governance, this part, which is outsourced, or would you call it informal governance? Simply speaking, there are a whole lot of other questions. Thanks.
Thanks so much. These are such great questions. And I think I'll go from the last one back to you, Prem, at the end. So the question about informality as a conceptual category. This is not good. I think that's a really important and critical one. And I think what you talked about, this kind of informalization of formal sorts of work. I mean, I've been working on digital platforms and they really represent this gray area. And I think, yeah, it's quite absurd to have the biggest category of work and also firms as something of a non-category, right? Everything that it's not supposed to be. And I think there's a real need to kind of, shelve it and start thinking of within one that we all know that there's a huge amount of variation, but sort of analytically try to separate them, the different ways in which you can think of whether something is formal or not, right? It's some of it is firm size, some of it is labor relations, some of it is like the conditions of work and things, some of it is whether it's properly regulated or not. And I think we need much clearer analytical categories and maybe like Smita is saying, look at the different sorts of variations. And then also, how how does a lot of the literature has actually argued that informality is beneficial, but for whom and why and things. So I think really, instead of lumping it all together, we need much to kind of unpack it and have much more analytical clarity of the different realms in which something can be informal. I actually ended up using it partly because it is for bureaucrats and administrators, it's a really important category, because that entire, say, talking about the rule of law and rule by law, and it's really organized. These are principal kind of categories around which they make decisions and policies. So whether something is authorized or unauthorized, whether work is organized or unorganized, whether something, so these constantly come up as categories, and the in reality, they all know that these are very mixed up. There isn't a clear separation, like you see even in informal spaces, and it's both, right? You also have formal rules and regulations. So you were talking about the industries in Dharavi and things. Some, like, they make legit pappers and things, and those pass like hygiene and safety rules and things like that, right? So I think we need to really start thinking much more clearly and analytically about these and the consequences in the different ways. And the other thing is it should not be the core organizing principle for, say, policy rules and planning and things. And that will kind of link back to Prem's question. On exclusion and inclusion, Champaka, I mean, that's a great question. I think to the extent I thought about it in the Jugaad state is that it allows for more accommodation and inclusion, but not in an equitable way. And I think inclusion that way is a relative, it's weaker than, say, equity, for instance, or equality, because they are somehow included. And there will still be exclusion because, depending on, say, you're in a new migrant group, you're not part of the networks that are able to influence policy and things like that. There's definitely, but I would say probably less exclusionary than what the formal system would offer. And the way in which inclusion happens is in this extremely unequal and contingent way. And you see the contingency where, there may be, whether there's that selective enforcement of the rule of law, where we've had these cases with the home demolitions, where people have been, and normally the reason people pay taxes, right? And that's again, like this very important area for urban research is this whole issue of urban finances, revenues, taxes, how that money is spent. But the homes that were demolished because they were violating master plan rules, they had a ton of paperwork. They've been paying taxes for years, right? But that could still be demolished, and the basic, like, human rights and constitutional rights become less important than a master plan rule. It's quite absurd. But I think there are a lot of issues, and I think the ways in which these Jugaad systems really do preclude systemic reforms and social mobilizations, because some people can always get in. So why would you all get together and try to challenge the system? In terms of charter cities, I haven't thought much about them, but I think as a solution, there'll be a really minor one. There'll probably be enclaves. And I'm thinking of, like, some of the research and things on charter schools in the US, right? Where there's a lot of work claiming that they have great results and student outcomes and all are better. But I mean, there's an argument, which is that's really because they can exclude, they can select the best sort of students and get rid of the bad ones. So so you can think of something very similar with charter cities and with some of the kind of, say, private cities, or you'll see in Delhi, for instance, the NDMC. Parts of cities that are under urban authorities will have better services, but that's also because they can, exclude people for whom they're not really able to deliver. The governance of slums. What sort of governance system do I, a more stronger democratized, a market democracy or a social democracy, and definitely we do need. It's not going to be a silver bullet. But there's an absolute need to have cities organized as some sort of a democratic political unit where urban citizens have some level of control over what decisions and plans and things are being made. In terms of master planning, I actually do think we should get rid of master plans. It doesn't mean that we should get rid of rules and regulations. I think right from the start we need to rebuild institutions, laws, planning frameworks. If they want to bring in master plans, there are many other ways of thinking about it. That's not that Corbusierian like mathematical model. I think the laws, the legal framework for planning is really, I'm not a lawyer, but there are a lot of great people in the legal space who are working on it. The laws are really bizarre because they're extremely detailed and prescriptive, and regulations on minor things like the size of a street vendor's table and how far they can, but on the really major principles, what constitutes the public interest? If the state decides to take over a whole a bunch of land for, those on those principles are really very vague. So I don't think any of the institutions are actually fit for purpose. So I think we need a really, and a much more analysis. The idea is not that there aren't any rules, but there need to be rules and regulation around things that really matter. Say safety, security, fire safety and things like that, and there is a problem in the system where so many of the rules make no sense that rule violation is normalized, right? And that's sort of why faith in city government is so low. But yeah, I think I would say right now we should get rid of master plans.
Could you put your telephone off? Whose phone is ringing?
Let me just go ahead and start. First of all, thank you, Prem, and thank you for all these great questions from the audience. I'll start, if you don't mind, with Omkar Nath's great question, because it's the one that actually got me started on a lot of this research. So you could respond to the question and say that, one of the things that pushes us all as economists is to try and think through economic development from the standpoint of the indicators, right? What is it that we use to measure? And is it fit for purpose? Will it allow us to measure this change? Two very practical responses. One is actually on the informal economy. I began it's not a fire drill, right? Or something where we have to leave the room. Shall I just keep going? Yeah. So on the informal economy, two quick responses. So a little over 20 years ago, I did some work on the informal economy with the International Labour Organization. And it was a historic moment because for the first time, workers and worker representative organizations of the informal economy were being included in the tripartite discussions of the ILO, right? So this was in 2000. Now, one of the things that has happened since then in my own work is I have become so skeptical of the nonsense perpetuated in the name of the informal economy that I can't bring myself to usefully using it for simple reasons. One touched on already by Shahana is there's a kind of ambiguity built into this term that already presumes what it is studying. So firms, for example, that use a certain amount of power, right? I mean, the old ideas of the unorganized and the organized economy were ways in which you described the structure and economic activity itself and built it into the form of regulation, which effectively meant you created a static category and nobody could study dynamism because the category itself was defined in a particular way. Now, that can go. It is unhelpful. It describes very little. Informal economy from the standpoint of broad sectors that fall within or outside areas of regulation is a little bit of a different definition of informality. But from an economic standpoint and in terms of studying technological capabilities, the way we look at labor in the statement informal labor is something, in my personal opinion, has got to go. We've got to stop using it. It's a lazy way of describing nothing. It tells us nothing about the activities. Yeah. So the informal economy, particularly to understand labor categories and the dynamism of investment, productivity, change of investment, it's quite useless, right? That number, whether it's 93%, 90%, 89%, is going to tell us very little about what to do. I would rather spend a lot more time studying what is actually available through surveys, not depend on the census in order to study phenomenon like that. That's one very pragmatic response. But from a conceptual standpoint, there are two publications people may be interested in. One is a co-edited book volume that has come out from UNRIST with the UN, which looks at new types of social policy. Because the argument is that in a climate where everybody is claiming austerity, in reality, you're seeing a big rise in social policy programs around the world, including in India. So social policy programs are a good indicator that it's not just the labor categories that are driving this scale of change. It's a way to understand what is happening across the world. So that book is shortly out, probably next week or something. It's worth a look, and you're welcome to contact me and I'll put you in touch with them. The second is a paper that was done with the ILO to look at South Africa and new ways of approaching the informal kind of category of work. And I just want to emphasize it because it's kind of the practical response. There is theory, there's theorizing, there's methodology, there's philosophy of economics, and then there's the practical, what do we do? Those two are what do we do? So if I can just respond quickly on the mental models, rules of the game question. It is important in any study in institutional economics, whatever the sub-school, whether it's neo-Schumpeterian, it's old, original, new, institutional economics, French regulation, doesn't matter. The idea is fundamentally that there are these mental models as much as there are the rules of the game. It's very easy when you say the rules of the game to get stuck in a kind of a structural pit that it's determinist. But in fact, we are constantly negotiating what we think the rules should be. Sometimes you have the power to change the rules, but the mental model in an economy that is dynamic and vibrant should be that people are constantly, as individuals, groups, professional categories, all the rest, in a constant state of churn. That's one of the premises. So the rules of the game, in a way, has to be, even with the Douglas North, he himself writes on mental models. So there's this other side of the customs behavioral change that has to be brought into the discussion. And maybe I should leave it there, except to say one question that I think all of us as researchers could agree on is that it's when we talk about development studies, economic development, development economics, whatever it is, we are stuck about 50 years behind in economics. We have not taught institutional economics in all of its forms. Most people graduate from an undergraduate education in India with having heard about Schumpeter, for example, in one seminar. They don't even know what that poor man did. So you can't discuss innovation, technological capabilities with our current curriculum. And I'm not even a Schumpeter particular fan. I've written papers criticizing the frameworks, but it is a fundamental gap in our thinking and our exposure to students that they do not have the language or the methodology to address dynamic problems. We have a language of something that is quite static, and the major form of change is supposed to be, let's say, class. Fine, build in class. But there are many other forms of change that have already occurred that we are not studying. So I think there's a kind of a big major hole in our understanding of where economics has gone, and very fruitfully, even whether it's ADRI or our own organizations, I think this is something that we can ramp up and get a conversation going, whether it's about Schrafa or Schumpeter, different kinds of institutional economics, that speak to the very practical questions of the kind that Omkar Nath's question addressed. So let me leave it there. I think there were some other ones, but we can talk after this. Thank you.
So thank you. That brings this session to a close. Thank you, Shahana. Thank you, Smita, for your wonderful presentation and response to questions. So we come to the end of not only this session, but the end of the workshop. And I think there might be some closing comments, but I'll just say, as Smita said in her last sentence, we have to keep the conversations going.
Thank you, everyone. We've come to the end of a very illustrious presentation. We heard talks on diverse topics, and some of the topics which do not usually come in a traditional sense, an economics seminar, were particularly extremely stimulating. Before I thank particularly Professor Ajit Sinha for organizing this and getting such diverse speakers from different fields to come and talk, to deliver their talks. I also thank all the speakers who came down, and I hope that our discussions continue and it is not just a one-off occasion where you came and visited. You keep coming and visiting more in terms of future collaborations, as well as through your network. We keep doing the kind of work that we aspire to do. And I think Adri's overall vision is similar to what the vision of this seminar was also. So as a token of our gratitude, we have a very small memento, which our one of the founding members of our institute, Sunita ji, will be presenting to the speakers. And we have Adrita, our little helper, to assist her in giving the memento to the speakers. So maybe we can have a group photo with all the participants. Yeah. I would request all the speakers to kindly come on stage for a group photo. Oh, Romer, chalega. So do we have everyone now? So
We don't have time. Please come, have a picture.
Okay, so